الحمد للمتوحد بجلاله المتفرد وصلاته دوما على خير الأنام محمد.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to the podcast at Khairabadi Institute. These podcasts have been titled as the Sacred Roots podcast. And alhamdulillah, I'm very honored to have with me today Maulana Shams Tamiz as last time, alhamdulillah. This time we've got a very important topic, very noble topic, and inshallah what we will be covering in today's podcast will be the history of the Māturīdis and generally just learning about who the Māturīdis are. So inshallah we'll be looking at different things, the Māturīdis as a large corpus of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah, them being under the umbrella of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah, some of the major scholars of the Māturīdis, and some of the major works and the different phases of Māturīdī Kalām as well, inshallah azza wa jal. And so we'll get straight into it. We've got a lot to cover, and we hope inshallah ta'ala makes this easy for us, inshallah. And we hope you guys enjoy this and learn so many things from it, inshallah azza wa jal. So just to start off, inshallah, assalamu alaikum for joining us. And I think to open the first question really, I think it's important to understand that the doctrinal creed of the largest denomination that came to be known as Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah, they found staunch defenders in the school of Imam Al-Huda, Alam Al-Huda, Abu Mansur Al-Māturīdī, rahimahullah ta'ala. And he's known to have codified the theology of Imam Azam, Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah ta'ala. And they, with the Ashʻarīs, the Ash'arīs, the founder of which was Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, rahimahullah ta'ala, they became the chief clearinghouse of Sunni Kalām and Sunni-centric heresiology. More predominantly though, for the early part at the least, in Transoxiana, Ma Wara' al-Nahar, which is modern day Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. So to just start off and to set the tone, can you briefly introduce to us the formation of this Sunni powerhouse of Kalām and Sunni heresiology, who are known as the Māturīdis, as being a distinct yet attached entity to the Ash'arīs and the Ash'arīs?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Subhanallah, it's a great question. I think it's important or interesting to look at Kalām in general as being a reaction of him. So if just for a moment, if I can just rewind a little bit to al-Imam al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, rahmatullahi alayhi, as it is well known and documented that he was the leading Mu'tazili scholar of the age, raised by his great uncle Abu Ali al-Jubba'i to take the seat of i'tizal. But he of course moved away from i'tizal, and there's obviously documented stories, if you remember when we read Sharh al-Aqā'id and stuff like that, you know, where he really found himself in a real conundrum between realizing that we are rejecting nusus muhaqqaqa, nusus mufassara, muhkama, because of these sort of supposed aqli, rational positions. And so that forced him, I mean, first he moves over to perhaps explaining creed in a very simple, may I use the term, athari way, and being very simple, which is fine, like the creed of al-Imam al-Tahawi, like no problem, that's absolutely fundamental and orthodox. But he later realizes, as many people today are realizing, that you need to have a level of rational argumentation for your beliefs. Because between you and your interlocutor, the nusus are not always musallam. So you have to have a language that is musallam between you, and the aql can do that. The aql is across the board. There's tafawut in aql, and that's where there can be a problem in nazar, in reasoning, but really it's the aql, that's the tool. And so we know that this is the beginning of a great reaction to i'tizal. There were reactions before that, of course, but this was a reaction that was able to actually damage i'tizal, and it was able to finish i'tizal.
That's right.
The culmination being in perhaps around the time or even before of Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, where if you look at al-Imam al-Ghazali, he's not really in conversation with the Mu'tazila anymore.
That's right, yeah.
He's looking at people like Ibn Sina and al-Farabi and al-Kindi, and he's dealing with those philosophers of religion. Because they weren't mutakallimun. They were what we call in our parlance hukama. So basically just philosophers, that they were looking at religion as a philosophy as opposed to a theology. They were not necessarily theologians. They were more philosophers. So Imam al-Ghazali turns his attention towards that. Now that tells you, and that is very much indicative of the end of i'tizal, that it finished.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Now, you have positions of i'tizal that remain even till this day. You'll have the odd person that will pop up. Recently, I think in Egypt it is, where there was a few people that were trying to revive the Mu'tazili school. Yes, very interesting. So they did the tahqiq of a lot of their books. I'm not sure if it's Egypt, so don't quote me, but there was definitely a few people that were reviving their books. Now, most of their books, not most, some of their books are muhaqqaq and matbu' published. But otherwise, they finished it as a school. So for me, just as the get-go, that is a very good indicator that Kalām does its job. Yeah. Now, as for Alim al-Huda, as you're saying, al-Imam, al-Jalil, al-Azim, Abu Mansur al-Māturīdī al-Hanafi, rahmatullah alayh, this is a very Central Asian experience of Kalām. And it is polemical, absolutely, as the Ash'ari tradition is polemical. It's polemical. And it is somewhat organic to the Central Asian experience. Now, there is a difference about how polemical were the Maturidis in relation to the Ash'arīs, because the Ash'arīs were directly coming out of i'tizal. But I have my own position on this, and we've talked about this before, off air, and I'll put that here if you like, which is that I do believe that there are many links of the Maturidis to the Mu'tazila which would have forced them to be polemical towards the Mu'tazila, and they were. If you look at the early books of the Mu'tazila, of Asad al-Maturidiyah, they are very polemical towards the Mu'tazila. There's no doubt in that. And you have to remember, as heavy on the heart this may be, perhaps, that many of the, or some of the key early Hanafi usuliyun had either beliefs of i'tizal or they were Mu'tazili themselves. So it's not to say that there are not Shafi'iyah who are Mu'tazila, but by and large the madhab fiqhi of the Mu'tazila was Hanafi. Now, there were lots of Hanafis, of course, that were not Mu'tazila, and that was Sunni, and that many, and despite some people may not perhaps appreciate this language that I'm using, but I do believe it, that many of those Hanafis we would term to be not Ahlul Hadith in the way we understand the history of Usul al-Fiqh, in that they were Ahlul Ra'i. Absolutely, they were the Fuqaha of Iraq. But they were actually very, very focused on Hadith and Athar. You had many people like that. And there were many people that were your traditional Sunni. And Imam Abu Mansur al-Māturīdī himself has his sanad to al-Imam al-A'zam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh. So what you find, and this is happening in Baghdad, I am not denying that, but I am saying in Central Asia what you find is that they see themselves as the gatekeepers to the Hanafi Sunnah. They see themselves as we are the actual tarjuman, representatives of the creed of al-Imam Abu Hanifa and of Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani and of al-Qadi Abu Yusuf and of the great A'immah of al-Ahnaf. We are those gatekeepers, and we are the true representatives and heirs of that tradition, and they put forward their sanad for it too. So just to finish on that point. So with the Mu'tazila, it's very easy to see the connection between the Ash'arīs because of Abu al-Hasan himself being a student of i'tizal. You can see why he was so equipped to be able to deal with i'tizal, and indeed he was, and he is the Imam of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah. But the reason why we say the Imam of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah is also Abu Mansur al-Māturīdī is he also had talaqi, And he also understood that very acutely. He was very much aware of what's going on. And that's why he also became so important in that part. And also one of the reasons why the Maturidis of Central Asia became so important is because there was a type of Hanafi that was Mu'tazili in Baghdad. This became the powerhouse of Hanafiism in that regard. As Sunni Hanafi,
Right,
as Sunni Hanafis. That's why they became so important. So Abu Mansur al-Maturidi isn't important just for no reason. He's important because it was a strategic from the perspective of divine intervention, because everything is fi'lullah. But he was strategically placed where he was at that time.
So it's interesting because what you find is that the Ma'turidis are not coming out of a vacuum.
No.
Actually, what you find is that because there's elements of i'tizal found within the Hanafi school, the Ma'turidis are a powerhouse of Sunni heresiology that come out in order to defend the not only the madhab but the creed of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, quite similar to how the Ash'arīs did in the period of Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. Disclaimer here that we want to mention is that even so Abu Mansur al-Maturidi is a founder of the Maturidi school, similar to how Abu al-Hasan, we say, is a founder of the Ash'ari school. But what we want to say here is, because this criticism came up quite recently, that our tradition is 700 years old. And so some people misunderstood and mistook that point to mean that our tradition only goes back 700 years. What we're actually saying is that Ahl al-Sunnati wal Jama'ah is from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, meaning it's from the time of the Sahaba, meaning Ahl al-Sunnati wal Jama'ah, the Jama'ah is the Sahaba alayhimur ridwan, and the Jama'ah is the Salafus Salihun. The Jama'ah is the majority. But what you find is that Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and Imam Maturidi, what they, in their eras respectively, what they're doing is that they are using the arguments of the opponents in order to defend that pure creed of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah, which is why if we're saying Imam Abu Mansur is the founder of the Maturidi school, we're not saying he's the founder of some new aqidah. He's the founder of this process of defending what we know as Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah, which is the period of the Sahaba themselves. So just moving on quickly, inshallah, swiftly, with regards to the second important question is that and this comes as a muqaddimah before, well, this comes as a great introduction to some of the positions that distinguish the Maturidis from the Ash'arīs before we actually get into the history of prominent thinkers within the Maturidi school. While obviously both schools fall under the Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah umbrella, which we very clearly established, alhamdulillah, and which is
I'll give you some quotes later.
Very clear for the listeners as well. Are there any theological differences that they may have amongst them? And we know they are, and we could obviously have a very lengthy discussion on that, keeping in mind when I mean theological here, we mean Furūʻ theological differences. Sometimes obviously they can be methodological differences, sometimes they're semantic, sometimes they're theological, and if I'm correct, sometimes it could be a mixture of some of those as well.
Well, if you take
so very quickly, that's the case, right? There is differences. There's a number of those. If for the ikhtisar and for keeping this concise, if we were to look in three areas of those differences that I had in mind, one of them was ma'rifatullah, which is salvation theory, and obviously tied into that comes the masala of taklīf qabla wūrūd al-Sharʻa. Could you give us a brief explanation of what the Maturidi position is with regards to ma'rifatullah and al-Taklīf, which separates them from the Ash'arīs, the body of the Ash'arīs, whilst both of them still being within Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah, and it being either a semantic or a methodological or even a theological difference, which is within the Furūʻ and not of course in the usul.
That's a good point that you mentioned about sometimes there can be it can be a mixture of both theological and methodological and semantic, because that's what the later ulama, particularly from the Maturidis, they will do. I think we can give some examples from that period, like Ibn Humām, and perhaps if we I'm sure we'll touch about the late Maturidi tradition in the Farangi Mahal, and there I'll speak from Mullah Nizamuddin al-Sihalwi himself, rahmatullah alayhi, the founder of the arguably the founder of the Farangi Mahal tradition,
the namesake of Dars al-Nizami.
Yes, of Dars al-Nizami. And I'll give you something from him as well that you'll really enjoy and like, inshallah ta'ala, which hits that point, where they explain it as the same.
That's right.
They're actually, we're not, but there's a slight difference, that's here, but really it's just about how we're applying the rule. But on the mas'ala of al-Taklīf qabla wūrūd al-Sharʻa, the difference really comes, let me tell you where there isn't a difference. So sometimes people think that what the Ash'arīs are saying is that you cannot know anything of good and evil via the aql.
Husn al-Qubh.
Yeah, al-Husn al-Qubh. So that you have to have the Sharia, you have to have the Quran, for example, or the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Your aql cannot know it. I'm being careful with what I'm saying. The aql cannot know it. This is a misconception against the Ash'arīs. They do not believe that. So, for example, in Bahr al-Kalām wal-Wasiyyat, the Sharh Wasiyyat al-Imam Abi Hanifa by Babarti, rahmatullah alayh, Babarti would say that إن العقل آلة يعرف بها بعض الحسن والقبح. Yeah, that the aql is a tool by which you can know some good and evil. Meaning the aql grants you inkishaf, because you can, I don't want to get into the mantiq of, is the aql the mudrik? No. If I was to stick to perhaps the later mantiq tradition of the Farangi Mahal, and many others as well from the manatiqa from before, Ahlul Islam, the mudrika is the nafs natiqa. The nafs natiqa is the mudrika, the aql, along with al-khabar al-sadiq and al-hawas al-salim and al-khamsa, that they are the asbab. But the actual mudrika is the nafs itself. But when you have that idrak via the aql, let's say, if I can be careful with my words, then you have an inkishaf that takes place. And so you can know the moral value of a particular act via the aql. Ba'd al-husn al-qubh. The Ash'arīs accept this totally. They don't disagree on this. So then, where is the difference? The difference is in taklīf. Are you mukallaf? Now again, another misconception. The Maturidis do not believe that you are mukallaf of all of what is good and evil via the aql before you have the sharia. Before bulugh al-da'wah, for example. The Maturidis are very specific that they believe in the mas'ala of ma'rifatullah. In that mas'ala, that the aql is sarih.
These two mas'alas are tied with each other.
They're tied with each other. So the aql is sarih, al-aql sarih, that's the words that they would use, such that there is no way that you have an excuse. So because you do not have an excuse, you are mukallaf. And they tie into this another argument to prove it, to establish it. And the Maturidis would say, so we have to go on a bit of a journey for this.
That's right, yeah.
So in order for me to accept that this is good and evil, I have to accept the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or a Rasul min Rasulillah. Yeah. In order for me to accept the Sharia, I have to accept the Rasul. In order for me to accept the Rasul, he has to be mu'ayyad bil mu'jiza. He has to be supported with a miracle or miracles. In order for him to be supported with miracles, I have to accept that there is fi'lullah, the act of God. Why? Because a mu'jiza, a miracle, is an act of God. Now, in order for you to accept the fi'lullah, the mudaf, you have to accept the mudaf ilayh, which is Allah. So now let's go backwards. You have to believe in Allah in order to believe in His acts. You have to believe in His acts to believe in miracles, because a miracle is a kharq an al-'ada. So you have to, it's a moving away from the norm of nature. and only that can be done through a miracle. So we have to accept Allah to accept the act of Allah. We have to accept the act of Allah to accept the miracle, because that's what it is. And we have to have the miracle to accept the Rasul. And we have to have the Rasul to accept what he's teaching us is right and wrong. So if you look at that journey, I mean, it's a wonderful journey. And it's an extremely clever argument, right?
Of the Maturidis.
Of the Maturidis on this, right? Because they said al-aql, the al-aqlu as-sarih is what they're talking about. The sarih aql, yeah? Now, for the Ash'arīs in this mas'ala, they would say that for the most part they agree with you, absolutely. But their idea is that the aql is not sufficient for taklīf. It's not sufficient as a da'iyah. That there has to be a warner that gives you tawajjuh towards that. So for example, in al-iqtisād fil i'tiqād, Hujjatul Islam, al-Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, rahmatullah alayh, this is his entire discussion. That you have to, and he gives an example of someone that runs out of a house and says to you, I think it's a scorpion in the house, that an intelligent person, that would be enough of a da'iyah. So their point is, and also, nobody is saying from the Ash'arīs or the Maturidiyah that the act itself it does not have the value of good and evil. What they're saying is that it's not intrinsic to the act, but it is by God's placing that value on it. So i'tizal is different because they do believe that the act has that moral value. Secondly, that they believe that the aql has a huge role to play, not only in unraveling, but in granting you taklīf. And thirdly, God is bound by that now. That God must punish you accordingly, and He must reward you accordingly. Whereas for the Maturidis, they say, no. In everything save ma'rifatullah, in sha'a aqab, in sha'a afa. Wal-akhdhu bil-adl wal-afu min karamihi. That's a direct quote from Mullah Nizamuddin in his Hashiyah Mullah Dawani, which I'll read for you a bit later. Even if he was on an island, if he was in the Amazon rainforest, and no Rasul ever came, because in this context perhaps, Al-Imam Al-Razi says, Al-Aql huwa Rasul.
But in all
Can
cases...
I clarify that? That's a loose end.
Yeah,
sorry.
Of course, yeah.
That's a loose end. He does not mean in any way a Rasul like a Rasul. Yeah. He is speaking in the sense that the way a Rasul comes and establishes a hujjah over you, the aql can establish a hujjah over you. So now, if the aql is sarih, then it is a hujjah over you, which means it is sufficient by way for you to know. And if it is sufficient by way of for you to know, and it is sarih in that sense, then you are mukallaf. And in fact, for the Maturidis, as I said, it makes sense for you to be mukallaf, because actually you need that to get to the Rasul anyway. When the Rasul's going to come and he's going to say, believe in Allah, believe in Allah, believe in me, believe in how do we trust you? And he performs a miracle. They need to believe that that miracle was even possible. That in this ada that we have, in the laws of nature that Allah Ta'ala has created, that it is possible for there to be a khalq. That can only be true if you believe in God. This is why atheists do not believe in miracles. It's true. And this is why the munkireen of mu'jizat from the Islamiyun, I'm going to use that term like Abu Hassan, he calls his book al-Maqālāt al-Islam, it's not really his book, but al-Maqālāt al-Islamiyun, why Imam al-Ash'arī's book is called that, is because he's not talking, because it's hairosography, or I think they call it a doxography, I think they call the work where you study the different firaq. Why he doesn't say of al-Muslimeen is because he's not affirming their being Muslim. He's affirming their nisbah to Islam. They are making the nisbah of Islam. Like for example, a Qadiani, you could say that they are, from that perspective, they are from Islamiyun. In what sense? That they make the nisbah of themselves to Islam. Not that the people of Islam consider them to be Muslim.
Or that they are.
Or that they are Muslim.
And just another point here is when you, in either case though, there's no wujub upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
No.
In ma'rifatullah or in other...
so when you really get down to it, there's actually no difference between the Ash'arī and Maturidi except in that one bit.
But even in
Which
that
is-
one bit, we're not establishing that the Māturīdī says there's wujub upon Allah.
No, there's no wujub upon Allah. No, the point is,
to
there's
punish
wujub upon man though.
Right, that's right.
So for the Ash'ari, they're saying not until the Rasul comes and gives you the warning, that is the da'iyah, the muwajjiha, that is making you mukallaf.
Right.
Whereas the Maturidis are saying the aql, even without a external Rasul coming, is sarih enough for it to make you mukallaf.
Right.
That it is a da'iyah that is sufficient to make you mutawajjih towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and because of that saraha you are mukallaf.
Interesting. So this is an interesting point where there is a theological Furūʻ secondary difference, but also methodological as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Nice.
And even though the way that they debate, of course, they have their twos and fro's, and I'm not saying anything like that. You know, this is an intra-Sunni discussion, but it's so fascinating when you think about it, how they explain it. But it is a difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you have to accept that. So when people say that there's semantic differences, I'm saying, well, if we were to say that Zayd, who is on that island, to whom there is no da'wah that ever came, there's no bulugh da'wah that ever came to that person, yet by his aql he must accept the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Mullah Nizamuddin actually adds on the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala too. But that's natural. You may think, what do you mean the sifat? The ma'ani sifat, for example, the salbiya sifat, the nafsi sifat, are going to be natural, because what made that person believe in Allah anyway is he's going to say, well, who made this? So he's already established qudra and irada and ilm.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, so my point here, and even with Sama', Basr and Kalām, the ulama generally say that they were, maybe with Kalām there's a difference, and Imam Al-Ghazali tries to include Sama' and Basr into that. Many of the mutakallimin do, to say that they're all aqli, and that's a whole different debate. If you like, we can go into it. But they say that those are actually established through the naql and not the aql. The Sama', Basr and Kalām from the ma'ani sifat are established through the naql. But many of the mutakallimun try to establish them, and they give some very, very good arguments to try and establish them actually from the aql and not the naql. Yani both, but yani from the aql. But that person would have naturally accepted the sifat. So Mullah Nizamuddin Sahalbi, that statement of him, I totally agree with that. But that person, Zayd, would he be, now, would there be tarattub al-iqab of him, not wujuban ala Allah? My point here is, for those that say that there's no actual theological differences between al-Ash'arī and al-Māturīdīyyah, for the Maturidis, Zayd over there is a mukallaf and will be punished in the hereafter. For the Ash'arīs, he is not mukallaf and will not be punished in the hereafter. Are you telling me that's not an actual difference?
So
That's a difference of Iman and Kufār.
Right. But interesting, you just hit that point home again. Still, both positions fall within Ahl Sunnah.
No, but because it's not from usul al-Dīn in that. It's not from what is al-ma'lūm min al-Dīn bid-darūra. They don't differ in anything which are from the dururiyat of Deen.
Meaning usuli theological differences are not between the Ash'arī and Maturidiyah. Okay, another one we could briefly go into.
Like, for example, takween. I don't know. I'm not going to go into takween, but I'll say this. The Maturidis, the Ash'arī do not affirm an additional sifa from the ma'ani sifat, which is a ma'na za'ida qa'im to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is azali qadim, called takween. They consider that just to be qudra from the perspective of tanjeez, right? Whereas the Maturidis do. And they have their own discussion on it. And they have a very fascinating discussion on takween. But you can't say it's not theological because they're debating a sifa of Allah. When you're debating a sifa of Allah, you're debating what? Metaphysics. So when you're debating metaphysics, that falls into the realm of theology.
Of course, yeah.
So they do have theological differences. You can't say the semantic. Even though the thamara is the same. Because they both affirm absolute omnipotence for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's why it's not an issue in terms of daruriyat of deen, but it is a theological difference.
Right. Another one we can briefly look at as well is al-Taklīf lil-Kufār bil-Furūʻ or al-Khitāb lil-Kufār bil-Furūʻ. Is this also a difference between the Maturidis and Ash'arīs? And if so, is it theological, is it semantic, or is it methodological, or any of the three combined? Or two of them combined?
So Imam Al-Razi says about this, that this is it's just a fruitless discussion. That's what Imam Razi says about it, yeah? And huwa man huwa, yeah? So ala ra'si wal ayn. But I found it very interesting from a particular perspective. For me, there is a real interesting aspect about this. And I wrote that paper on it, I don't know if you remember, which And although this discussion is not really had in the books of theology, it's had in the books of usul al-fiqh. This issue of al-khitab lil-Kufār bil-Furūʻ is a discussion that is largely had in the books of usul al-fiqh. However, it's a very interesting debate, because I always had a question, which was that in the hereafter, you have darajat of Jannah and darakat of Nar. So why is it that some people will have more or less adab? Let's just think about it that way. See, with Jannah, we can understand that. You did more good deeds. Yeah. Now, if there's no khitab lil-Kufār bil-Furūʻ, aslan, that, yani, because of them being Kufār, yani, adam al-Iman, then there's no khitab of Furūʻ towards them. So they're not really sinning after that, are they? If you think about it. Like a kafir, his sin is the kufr. That is what will bar him from Jannah, and that will give him khulud fil nar, right?
Just a little point here, just for the audience. Al-khitab lil-Kufār bil-Furūʻ means?
So, is the Quran or the Sharia, is it directed towards the Kufār with regards to subsidiary issues?
That's right.
Particular issues. So now, if you think about it this way, if you're a kafir, na'udhu billah min dhalik, wa nas'alullah al-afiyah, if you're a kafir, after your kufr, what is there left for you to do? Yeah. So now if you say, no, but obviously Fir'aun and a person that was actually quite positive and did good things, but they didn't want to accept Allah Ta'ala. They didn't want to change their life. They didn't want to do things the way Allah wants them to do. They just want to live in their life and enjoy what they thought was an enjoyment of lahu and la'ab. But they were no Fir'aun. They didn't murder anybody. They didn't steal from anybody. They didn't do anything like that. But that was a kafir that denied Allah, which is the greatest evil. Right? So is Fir'aun and that person going to be in the same place in Jahannam? Put it this way. Where's the munafiq going to be in Jahannam? He's going to be in the asfal naam. It's going to be right at the bottom. So why is that person, if he's a kafir and he's a kafir, why is he at the top tier where there's only sandals of fire? And why is he in the bottom? And I don't want to get into the descriptions of Jahannam, but the description of the asfal daraka in nar. Why is the difference? Why is that difference even there? So from this perspective, the Hanafis, they held the position that no, there's nothing after that, after kufr. Once a person is a kafir. Why? Because the shart for the khitab bil furū' was iman. Since the shart is not there, it's gone. For the Shafi'iyah, so I'm using Hanafi and Shafi'i terms now, as opposed to Maturidi and Ashʻarī.
Because it's a masala of usul.
Because it's a masala of usul. But it is a difference between the two schools. So, whereas for the for the Shafi'iyah, more specifically, to be more particular here, that they would say, no, there is khitab towards it. Why? Because they don't explain it from the perspective of soteriology, salvation theory. Not salvation theory, soteriology, what's going to happen in the hereafter, right? But that's what made sense to me, because it answered a lot of those questions. That makes sense now. Because you were a murderer, you were not a murderer, that's why you're different. So why would there be a difference if there was no khitab al-Furū' towards you? That's one thing. Another thing is that the argument that the Shafi'iyah give is that Adam al-Iman is not a shart. Like, for example, if it's the time for dhuhr and you don't have wudu, can you pray Salatul Dhuhr? No. But is it still fard upon you? Yes. So they argue, and if you look at the al-Bunani, for example, that's the main source that I used, the Hashia on the Jamal Jawami on I think it's on Mahalli, if I remember correctly. But if you look at that tier of Usul al-Fiqh books in the Shafi'i Usul al-Fiqh books, then this is the argument they use, one of the arguments they use, which is, and it's a very convincing argument, which is, it's the time for dhuhr, you do not have wudu, so Adam al-wudu does not remove the wujub of salah. So just because you don't have iman, it doesn't remove the wujub of the furū'. So you're actually getting the more sin for that. So from that perspective, it's very interesting, and that's why I wrote on it. And there was
how do the Māturīdis come back on that?
No, for them it's kufr is the shart. For example, if you think about it, for them it's like they're equivalent to saying read namaz, salah. I switched to my Persian Urdu there, right? Pray your salah, right? Pray your salah, but I don't have iman. Well, can you pray salah? No, I can't pray salah. Or more yet, aql. Is a child mukallaf of the sharia? No. Why? Because the shart is what? Aql. It's from the shariat, isn't it? Bulugh. For the Maturidis, don't forget, for Imam Abu Mansur al-Māturīdī, the condition for taklīf, for a sabi, to become mukallaf, is not to be pubescent. It's to be aqil.
Even if that happens before.
Even if they were younger than your average age, like you would, that quote-unquote child does not show other alamat, but if they are aqil and they have understood, then that is enough for taklīf. Why? Because al-aql sarih. You see how these masail all tie into that one masala. That once you understand that qaida, then all of these different issues, they tie into that.
Interesting.
This is why, by the way, just a small intersection and tangent. This is why I've repeated this 1,000 times. I say this in every single class, that with Kalām, it is not about mastering the mas'ala of Kalām. It's about cracking the system of Kalām. That once you have the world view of Kalām and you understand the thinking, you might even make a mistake in the mas'ala sometimes. Like it happened. Like you didn't revise it or something will happen like that, right? But the system of Kalām, that's how you now view the world. And that was the function of Kalām. It was to give you an outlook, a manhaj, a world view. Otherwise, you're very, very confused. And you don't know which way you're going. And you could easily, the tashkīk al-mushakkik can cause you a lot of problems. But once you're very clear in terms of your paradigm, and Kalām is that, that's its purpose, its maqsood, is to give you that. Once you have that, then the Masā'il just fall into place, because you would I would imagine what they would say on that. A bit like somebody that is a master, for example, of usul al-fiqh. A master, they might sometimes not know the exact mas'ala. Whereas you have a mufti, someone who's read all the fatawajat, read all of the books of the fatwa books of the ulama. And they can give you fatwa and they understand all of those things, right? And obviously they know usul al-fiqh, etc., right? But maybe they don't always know how to tie that into a qaida. But then you have somebody that's a very good, because they've understood the system of fiqh. And usually it's a combination of those two that you get great a'immah of fiqh.
Okay, so just coming on to our main section of this podcast, inshallah. We want to go through some of the key phases of Maturidi Kalām, starting with Imam Abu Hanifa's influence himself. And then within this, I think we could discuss highlight three major phases. Now, I've put these three phases as the first phase being the 6th century Hijrah, but obviously we can look at before and after as well. This period witnessed the codification of detailed encyclopedic works, and in this area you have the likes of Imam Abu Mu'in al-Nasafi, powerhouse of Maturidi Kalām. And the second age we're looking at around about the 10th to the 14th century. Again, we can look before and after, but what we find in this flourishing era is that you see the development of in-depth comparative Sunni theology, with details of both Maturidi and Ash'ari positions, and you have figures in this area like Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Kamal Pasha and Al-Allama Nablusi as well, a little bit later on. From here you can also shed light on the inception of mazj of both traditions that begins to happen, so we can look at that as well inshallah in detail. And then we have a third age, a later period. And this period and this phase involves the masterful continuation of Maturidi discourse through schools like the Farangi Mahal and the offshoot, the prominent offshoot of the Farangi Mahal known as the Khairabadis. And in this area you have prominent scholars and figures like Mullah Nizamuddin Sihalwi himself, the namesake of the Dars Nizami. You have the likes of Faẓl-i-Rasūl Badayuni from the Badayuni tradition, again a Farangi Mahali scholar. And then you have of course last but not least the great Allāma Faẓl-i-Haq Khairabadi rahimahullah ta'ala, who's a very prominent figure of this Khairabadi offshoot of the Farangi Mahal tradition. So we can have subsidiary phases as well that can come out of that inshallah, and you can take us away on that journey.
Inshallah ta'ala. I'll give you a tartib, the same tartib that you gave actually, but maybe breaking down into a few different sub areas. Yeah,
Right.
but broadly, yes, what you said is exactly the case. So you've got this early period, which perhaps you can say from 300 to 400. You wanted to start with Imam Abu Hanifa. Look, Imam Abu Hanifa was definitely someone that was engaging in rational discourse. We have his debates recorded with atheists. He was definitely somebody. I mean, Imam al-Tahawi, how does he begin his creed? This is the Aqīdah of... And that Aqīdah, by the way, I'll tell you something else, yeah. The Aqīdah of al-Imam al-Tahawi is not an Aqīdah that did not come out of a rational mind. Because when he's arguing, for example, on the issue of jiha, now it's easy, Imam al-Tahawi is listing Inna Allah wahidun wa la sharika lahu wa la shay'an yu'jaza, etc. But look at the points that he's saying. Like when he talks about there's no jiha for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, Allah ta'ala doesn't say that in the Quran, does he? If you think about it. Allah ta'ala does not use that statement in the Quran, does he? Or wherever you turn, you'll find the countenance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc., etc., etc. But the qa'idah that he took out, the doctrine that he took out of that was what? That don't ever fall into tajseem. Allah has no jiha. Allah has no makan. Allah is khaliq al-makan. Yeah. So, even though it's a very, very basic creed, it's actually rooted in deep theology, actually. That's why it's attracted so many commentaries, over the years.
I mean, you got the MATURIDIS and the Ash'arīs writing commentaries
Absolutely.
and teaching it in their schools, yeah,
Absolutely.
respectively.
Absolutely. Because they don't disagree in the central tenets of faith. That's the point. What's ma'lum min ad-Dīn bid-darūrah, they don't differ on it. So in any case, you've got this early period between about 300 and 400. And this this period you could term as a takween or a tadween. This is the period of codification of the early formulation of the school. And in that you have obviously, for example, here you have the real Kitab al-Tawheed of Abu Mansur al-Māturīdī rahmatullah alayh, which now mashallah has been, I think it has 2 or 3 different publications now of it, whereas for a long time it wasn't. And Allah bless the Atrak that did a lot of work on Imam Al-Māturīdī. Also his Ta'wilat al-Quran in this period.
That's right.
Which is one of the greatest tafsirs of the Quran. And you've for me, like when I bought his tafsir, I mean it's huge. I carried it on my head. I really did. And it's an amazing tafsir, and I really recommend it. Again, Allah Ta'ala bless the Atrak, Isam in Istanbul, which is one of these largest, if not the largest Islamic studies library in the world. They edited it and published it for the first time. Walillah alhamd. And I remember in 2014, there was a brother with whom I was doing a little bit of studying. He was at Econ, and he was looking at the ethics of Imam Maturidi from the Ta'wilat. So he was extrapolating basically moral ontology, the discussion of Taseen wa Takbih from the Quran, the tafsir itself. That's why I say the Ta'wilat al-Quran is actually a very strong theological work. You may have to extrapolate the Masā'il, but if you know where to look, then you can find it. Otherwise, it would be a great tafsir to go through from beginning to end anyway. You also have like
just before you move on to who are you going to mention? Sorry.
As-Sawād al-A'zam al-Samarqandi.
That's right. Just before
Matn al-Tahawiyya as well.
Right. Just before Allama Samarqandi we come to, so just so the viewers are on the same page. So we've got Abu Mansur al-Māturīdī comes in the period of Tadween, so 300 Hijrah onwards. So Abu Mansur al-Māturīdī passes away in 333 Hijrah, and again he's codifying the creed of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, was earlier than him, and so was also Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi. So al-Tahawi passed away actually around about 321 Hijrah, but again you find that Imam al-Tahawi is again coming from that tradition of Imam Abu Hanifa, because his own book is Bayan Aqidat Fuqaha al-Millah Abi Hanifa wa Abi Yusuf wa Muhammad ibn Hassan. So we find that Imam Abu Mansur al-Māturīdī is coming at the end of that chain in this period called Tadween, where he's basically codifying what has come
Kalām.
Before him.
He is
into the means of a Kalamic process.
That's it.
Interesting.
That's it.
And we also find what's interesting is that you mentioned this earlier, just to hit that point home again, that what you find in Imam Abu Mansur al-Maturidi's period is that he's excelling in refuting the Mu'tazilites, just as his counterpart Imam Ash'ari had done early on in Baghdad and Basra, refuting those same Mu'tazilis. And there's aside from these two books you mentioned, Kitab al-Tawheed and his tafsir, Ta'wilat al-Quran.
Ta'wilat al-Quran.
You have other books ascribed to him as well, and in there he's refuting the Rawafid.
Yes.
He's refuting the Mu'tazilis, the Khawarij, the Karamatis, etc. So an amazing.
He's a powerhouse.
An amazing, opening to the period of Tadween by Imam Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, becomes the Imam basically of this entire trajectory. Yeah.
And you know how they talk about him, like his students and his sub-students, so his grand-students, like in their work. So even if you read like the Nasafis, I'm going to pluralize it in English because there's a few of them, right? And how they speak about him is like they the ones that call him Imam al-Huda.
Imam al-Huda, Alam al-Huda.
Yeah, that's what they call him. Yeah, so he's the Alam al-Dar of guidance. So they really looked at him very fondly, and they call him the Imam of our school.
Yes.
They say that. It's not like something that happens much later on that, it seems like it began with him. No. Very early on, they were saying it's him.
Right.
He was an important... How like Imam Abu Hanifa was an important mouthpiece of the Iraqi school, the school of the Fuqaha. How Malik was the great mouthpiece of Ahl Medina. He was the great mouthpiece of the Central Asian Kalamic experience.
That's right.
And he was an early codifier of it.
That's right, mashallah. And then you came back to Ibn Hakim al-Samarkandi.
Yeah, so these are different works that were written. If there's anything you want to say, otherwise I'm going to move on to...
Sawad al-Azam.
Al-I'tiqad, Sa'id al-Naysapuri as well.
Right.
So there's a whole list of books, etc. Perhaps, you can, when you put this up, you can put this in a list or maybe like a Google document. Yeah. I can give you a whole chart of all of these names and the dates with the books. And interestingly, what I have here, and Allah bless our Shaykh, Dr. Hamza Bakri, when we did Maturidi Kalām with him, one of the things that he loves doing, and he's so brilliant at it, is that he would give us the works of usul that were being written at that time, because you have to remember, and this would I'd love to do another session on this, which is the trajectory of usul al-fiqh. And so what he was basically highlighting, in not so many words, is that you'll see the books of usul developing as you see the books of Kalām developing. Right, as you see a tadween happening in Kalām, you're seeing it happening in usul. As you see a tabayun happening in Kalām, you'll see a tabayun happening, and I'll explain what tabayun means in a minute, meaning in this context, what that means in usul. And you'll see that, and when the mazj takes place, you'll see that happening in usul al-fiqh, etc. So you'll see that the same, if you had a scholar that was both writing in Kalām and in usul al-fiqh, you will see that flavour of mazj taking place in both, etc., etc., etc. So I'll give you this and you can put it up. The second period that I have...
Just before you move on to that second period, Ibn Hakim Samarkandi is very close to Imam Maturidi, his period. Yeah. So we were reading that he was actually a student of Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. Yeah. And
or a colleague, they say.
And there's a mention of being a colleague because he... actually what's interesting is that the fact of him being a colleague is not disputed. That's quite clear because their teachers were the same, but there has been mention of him being a student as well. So which is very possible.
Which is very normal,
and he was the Imam in that period as well. But one other interesting scholar that we discussed in this period was Abu Layth Samarkandi.
Oh yes.
And what's going on with Abu Layth Samarkandi?
Well, in terms of his being his writing style,
Masail Abi Layth.
Yeah. So one of the things about him is that, what some people have said, and we can have a look at, we can read a little bit from his text.
Yeah, please.
Which is that he was, some people have said that he was quite similar to the Ash'arīs. Because if you look and at the Maturidi books, just take Mat al-Nasafi. Mat al-Nasafi is like that's like the lub of that early Maturidi school. Like, you wouldn't know what the early Maturidis were like. So anyone that's read Maturidi Kalām works, they'll know that the discussions begin with Aqā'id al Aḍudīyyah, right? It begins with ontology, epistemology, cosmology. they begin with that. And then they go into the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah? Wujud and then sifat, etc. Abu Layth, interestingly, and the matan is very small. I actually have a PDF. I'll read from it. In fact, I think we probably have it because there was a sharh written on it. Yeah, and firstly, his style of writing is like, إذا قيل لك وكيف تؤمن بالله. Like, he's not writing like قال أهل الحق حقائق الأشياء ثابتة والعلم بها محقق. Like, he's not writing like that. He's writing like very different. Like, he's writing and he begins, look at this, I'll just try to read the matan because they've put the sharh in between. He says, فَالْجَوَابْ on that, كَيْفَ تُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ. He says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى, look, listen to this now. Anyone that's done Ash'ari Kalām
it's very similar.
And read the Sunusi Creed, this guy sounds familiar. Imagine he's already said, يَجِبُ عَلَى كُلِّ مُكَلَّفٍ, that section, and he explains wajib, mustahil, mumkin. So imagine that's like Sunusi done, right? What's the next bit? Look what he says. إن الله تعالى واحد حي عالم قادر مريد سميع بصير متكلم.
So he brought the Ma'ani Sifat here.
He's put the Ma'ani Sifat because they're the only Sifat that are disputed historically are the Ma'ani Sifat.
No one disputed.
There's difference of opinion in them. Like, for example, the Mu'tazila deny these Sifat, don't they? Perhaps maybe with one of them they were kind of forced to have to accept, but that's a whole separate debate, right? But this is where there's been a debate that what is the nature of the ma'ani sifat, because if you say there are ma'na za'id ala dhat, what does that mean? So when you say la ayn wa la ghayr, what does that mean? When you say hiya aynu dhat, what does that mean? Have you denied them? Is there a different discussion, etc, etc, etc? But the fact that he bought it like that, you look at it, you think, oh, that's really interesting, and even the fact that, because he didn't say, no, and by the way, he's mentioned them here as ma'nawiyah. I should make that clear as well. Like, he didn't say hayat, qudra, ilm. He said alim, he said qadir. But we know that the Maturidis affirm the sifat. So by mentioning this, in this tartib, he's already indicating towards the ma'ani sifat as qudra, as ilm, as hayat, as sam, basar, and kalam. So it's just the fact that he begins, and if you look at the muhshi, the sharih, what does he say? Hayyun bi hayatin qadimatin qa'imatin with that. So the sharih was not unclear about what that was. So now if you were to read this, it's very much, it's very similar to that style. So, and it's in that period, it is definitely not similar to how the Maturidis were writing.
So even though it's the period of the Tadween, what you're finding is that his book, which is the book is called al-Masā'il Abi Lays fil Iman. What he's doing here is that he is kind of compatible with the Maturidi and the Ash'arī the book. That's quite interesting. So even though, so what he's doing is his book's written in a very in a way which is compatible with the way the Ash'arī write, and by bringing the Ma'ani Sifat in there. So
even though I have to make that clear,
almost like an overlap.
I have to make that clear. Even though he used the Ma'nawiyah there, he said Qadir, he didn't say Qudra.
Right.
But the Maturidis affirm the Qudra. So the fact that he's mentioned that, he's indicating towards that. He's not, and he's using them as they are sifat. So it's not, I have to just make that clear in case somebody says, well, you said Ma'ani Sifat, but he said Qadir. He didn't say Qudra. No, when a Maturidi says Qadir, you know that Allah is Qadir bi Qudratihi, because that's the position of the Maturidis.
And this is the same Abu Lays Samarkandi who obviously wrote, it was a major Hanafi jurist, he wrote Bustan al-Arifin and Tanbih al-Ghafilin as well. This takes us into the period you mentioned next, which was...
Yes, so then you have a period of what they call a Tabayun, which is there's a clear distinction between the Maturidis, to the point that some of these Maturidi scholars will be writing polemically against the Ash'arī. So for example, you could say that this period is from around 450 to 550 Hijrah.
Some even say about 600, right?
Yeah, it can go up to. Sometimes they say that's a period of tafahum. Yeah, but we'll talk about that. So here, for example, you have Usul al-Din of al-Pazdawi, you have Tamheed li Abi Shakur al-Salimi, you have Bahr al-Kalām, you have al-Tamheed. So so al-Bahr al-Kalām, al-Tamheed, and Tabsut al-Dillah, all were written by
Abu Mu'in,
the greatest of Maturidi scholars of perhaps all time. Like, he is standalone, Abu Mu'in al-Nasafi, rahimahullah. And if you read these works, particularly the Tabsirah, you'll see, and we can go pull it out right now if you like, right? But you'll see he's very polemical towards Ash'arīs. In fact, I remember Dr. Ali once saying that, نعم ذلك الكتاب الذي يعني ألفه خلافا للأشاعرة. That's the book that he wrote against the Ash'arīs.
Just before we go to Imam Abu Mu'in, can we just have a moment on Abu Yusr al-Pazdawi and his Kitab Usul al-Dīn? What's going on in his work, and why is that a major work in this period of Tabayun?
I think one of the is about Tawallud.
Yeah, I think
he was one of the ones that first introduced discussions on
Tawlid and
Tawallud and stuff like that.
That was the Ash'arī position of Tawlid and Tawallud.
No.
Although I think you mentioned last time that although the Maturidis of course believe in Tawlid and Tawallud,
but it wasn't mentioned in the books before that time. In that way, like there is mention of it, but it's argued that he is one of the first people
Maturidis
to actually incorporate that into the text.
While it's refuting the Mu'tazilis,
and it stayed forever after that. So now whenever you a Maturidi book, like you'll find the later Ash'arīs, they will have a section on like a Tawallud. You know, by a Tawallud we mean secondary causality.
Right.
Yeah, that this sabab creates that other thing. No, because for Ash'arī al-Maturidiyah, every single cause and effect is directly the act of God. Yeah, and your cusp is the way in which you are accountable. And that the way in which Allah Ta'ala, according to Allah's Ada Karima, Sharifa, that Allah Ta'ala creates, He doesn't have to, of course, right? Just because you want, you do cusp of a particular act, Allah Ta'ala doesn't have to, but it's His Ada Karima that He does do it. No. And remember, Kharq al-Ada is only for mu'jizat and karamat and things of that nature. So this period, so at-Tamheed, I mentioned Bahr al-Kalām, Matl al-Aqā'id li Abi Hafs al-Nasafi, and I know there's some dispute on, and I like what you said last time we were talking about this, about, which is that although there's a difference of opinion on whether it was Abu Hafs Umar al-Nasafi or whether it was
there's a difference about whether it was
Najmuddin.
Yeah.
But because of Taftazani
did tahqiq
and held the position of Abu Hafs Umar al-Nasafi, then we just submitted to a Taftazani and said, "Huwa al-Muhaqqiq."
So they say that it was. So there is a position by some academics that it was Burhanuddin.
Okay, Burhanuddin.
And this Abu Hafs al-Nasafi is Najmuddin.
Okay.
But what is a nice way to end that debate is that if the Muhaqqiq did tahqiq, then yani yakfi.
Then we do taslim.
Yeah, we do taslim.
Yeah, and because we love Taftazani rahmatullahi ta'ala, yeah, Sa'ad. Naam. طيب, then you have a Tamheed of al-Lamishi, obviously a very popular book now because it's been published and because it's taught at Ikan, and that's allowed at Tamheed في قواعد التوحيد to become more popular. And also you have تلخيص الأدلة للسفار. You have al-Kifāyah min al-Hidāyah, al-Bidāyah min al-Kifāyah للصابوني. If I can just take a moment to ponder upon a Sabuni for a minute.
Sayyid, if you don't mind, before you do ponder on that, can we just go a little bit back and just work down that trajectory? So you mentioned a very important figure who is Abu Mu'in al-Nasafi. Can we just start with him and just work our way through each one of those scholars, and then we can end with As-Sabuni?
Sure. Well, Abu Mu'in al-Nasafi, as I like to say, he is the Imam Muhammad to Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. He is what Imam Muhammad is to Abu Hanifa. Yeah. Because Imam Muhammad is through his Zahir Riwayah, the six and all of that. He's the one that essentially writes down the madhab, isn't he? So he's super important. And everyone acknowledges that. Like if there was Abu Hanif Thani, it's Muhammad al-Shaybani. I like that. That rhymes. Yeah. Whereas for Imam Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, al-Imam Abu Mu'in al-Nasafi, rahmatullah alayhi, he is one of the greatest writers in Maturidi Kalām.
Interesting.
Like he brings it all out. Like Tabsut al-Dilla's thickest, you can get it in 2 volumes and 3 volumes. Okay. Like it's a heavy duty work. It's not a small work. Naam, is it the size of the Shal Mawaqif? No. I mean, by that period, Kalām had developed a lot more. There was a huge amount of inclusion of al-Aḍmah and of Hikmah and all of those sort of things that are included in that period that are just not happening at this period. But if you're looking at just pure theology, like a work that's just written on theological matters, not delving into ontology, al-ʻa'mmah, not delving into these other discussions, but just focusing on theological discussions, it's a very heavy book from that perspective. And so he becomes so important. And after him, everything is measured against him. And everyone's quoting him.
Right.
Yeah. So he is like the marja, or the marja rather. Right. He is the one to whom all of the Maturidi writers will return.
So it's interesting how we could summarize what you're saying there is that he's the greatest single representative of
Absolutely.
the Maturidi school.
He is so important.
Of dialectic theology, just as like Imam Baqilani or Imam Al-Razi or al-Hamdiyyah for the Ashʻarī school. He is the Baqilani and the Ahmadi of the Maturidi.
He is the Baqilani.
He's the Baqilani.
He is the Baqilani, yes. Because Imam Baqilani gives a huge service. And remember, Baqilani is not a direct student of Imam al-Ash'ari, he's a grand student.
Of course, yeah.
So, but he is to the Ash'ari school, yes, what Baqilani, to the Maturidi school, what Baqilani was to the Ash'ari school.
Nice.
Everybody else, like I said, like there's certain people that just wrote in a certain way that just, they substantiated the school.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah.
And he's also a teacher of Abu Hafs and Umar al-Nasafi, interestingly. Okay, so then we got Umar al-Nasafi, Kitab al-Aqā'id, which is usually known as Aqīdah Nasafi.
Yeah. Al-Aqā'id al-Nasafi.
Al-Aqā'id al-Nasafi, yeah. So Umar al-Nasafi, interestingly, is a teacher of al-Imām al-Ghinaani. And what we're establishing here is that he is the author of the book al-Aqā'id, and we have the famous Sharh al-Aqā'id, which is taught in the Dars al-Nizami curriculum as a commentary on that work by al-Muhaqqiq al-Taftazani. You mentioned Lamishi. What's happening with his work at-Tamheed li Qawaid al-Tawhīd?
At-Tamheed al-Lamishi is like a beautiful ikhtisar of the Tamshat al-Adillah.
Again in the Tabayun period.
There's also like al-Umdah. These are also like, you can say they might not have been written necessarily as summaries, but if you were to read the Tamheed of al-Lamishi and you go back to Tamshat al-Adillah, you will realize that you could use Tamshat al-Adillah for your preparation for that book.
So it's like it's showing the influence of Tamshat al-Adillah. Nice.
Huge. He's so important.
And again, his work...
And al-Tamheed is a great little matan. And it's a beautiful little matan. It's not like a matan like the Aqā'id al-Nasafiyah, it's tiny. No. It's bigger, but it is a great matan. If somebody wanted to go beginning to end and understand all of Maturidi, is in its without some of the discussions that you will find amongst the later Maturidis, and we're not going to get to that period just yet. But like in that early period, whereas like for example Sabuni, you're going to allow me to ponder upon him for a moment, right?
I'll give you that.
Yeah, that's larger. Whereas the Tamheed is like a good book for Tadris.
So it's a book that's revolving around the classic themes of the Maturidis.
Yes.
Nice.
Yes, and so for me it was a really important book to study. It was the first book that I ever studied after Aqīdah Tahawiyya in Maturidi Kalām. Is specific to Maturidi Kalām.
Nice.
And so to have come from studying a certain amount of Ash'ari Kalām to go into that, it was like a breath of fresh air in the sense that
this is the Maturidi.
Yeah, this is the Maturidi Kalām.
Okay, interestingly, in this period we've also got Sirajuddin al-Ushi. He's a
Badr al-Amali.
Islamiyya fi Usul al-Dīn.
Naam.
Not also known as Badr al-Amali.
Naam.
What's going on there?
Well, again, it's very small. Badr al-Amali in no way includes most of the Masā'il of Kalām. Of even Maturidi Kalām, of even early Maturidi Kalām. It doesn't, it's too small. I think it's like 53 lines.
68
something
verses,
like that.
68 verses, I think.
It's very, very small. It's tiny.
Lam rhyme poem, isn't it?
Yes, it's tiny. So it doesn't, like, for example, I've taught it once, and I'm going to be teaching it again, after Ramadan, inshallah. And I actually struggled to teach it the first time. Because, like the taqsim of sifat, it's because it's so early, like we're reading it largely for the barakah, and because it's so good and so concise, so it's easy for the student to memorize it, they can sing it, etc. But like when you've got a certain, with the later matun that are written, like the Sunusis for example, the sort of tartib that's taking place, it's so refined that now when you're going back and it's a little bit, it's not so murattab in that same way. I'm not saying it's not murattab, but but it's not as refined as the later mutun. That was one struggle. The other struggle is because a lot of the Masail are not included. And so now you've got to give quite a heavy sharh. So what I realized is that it's better when you're teaching the matan, because remember, you're teaching a matan to beginners. You don't want to burden beginners with discussions in Kalām and Falsafa. You want to just give them the basic of the discussions, create an image, tadarrujan, move on to the next one, and then by the end they'll be swimming in Kalām. But at the beginning you don't want to do that.
So this is possibly the hikmah of why he wrote it.
Write it so small. But I'm saying this is my own experience, and this is entirely my own experience, that they should pick a sharh. Like for example, Mullah Qadi or somebody else.
Commentary would cover all these Masail.
Yes, and they should, when you teach the book, teach the sharh. Don't teach the matan on its own. Because you will have to do so much work. Yeah.
But it's interesting, Allah Ta'ala give it so much qabuliyat.
Yeah, subhanAllah.
It's widely accepted all around the world.
Oh yes,
you go to Turkey, to Pakistan, to
it's
different parts of the world, and you'll find Badul Amali being
like the Jawhara.
Like the Jawhara for the...
But obviously the Jawhara is bigger. The Jawhara, the Jawhara, Badul Amali, and you'll find if you attend the course after Ramadan, Badul Amali includes many isharat as well. Yes. But the Jawhara has so many isharat. And this is why the Jawhara attracted so many commentaries. Because the Jawhara is longer, firstly, in and of itself, but secondly, it includes so much kalam in it. That's why it was such a good poem.
So let me throw a question at you then, a little brief one. What would you say would be a nice first book to teach Maturidi Kalam?
Well, what we did, I can only say that, here, was we started off with the Matan of al-Nasafi, just to give a broad image.
Nice.
And then we did al-Aqā'id al Burhaniyah, which is like not in this whole system, but it's different. That's more Ash'ari.
Nice.
And then I think we did the Sanusi, I'm not sure. We did something else. And then we did As-Sabuni's al-Bidayah, fi Usul al-Din.
So off you go.
And okay. And then we did, so let me just finish that point. We did al-Bidayah fi Usul al-Din, and we did it cover to cover. And we read it from al-Kifāyah quite a lot, which I'll talk about now. And now we're doing the Sharh al-Aqā'id al-Nasafiyah of Taftazani, rahmatullahi. That's our route. The route in Ikan was to begin with, you do a Sanusi, Sharh al-Sanusi, al-Barahin, the commentary on it, the tartib done by Sheikh Sa'id Fawda as your first Ash'ari book. And then we did the At-Tamheed of al-Lamashi. And then the second was al-Iqtisād fi al-I'tiqād of al-Ghazali and the Ma'alim fi Usul al-Din of al-Razi. And that gave you now the Razian, Ghazalian flavor, and what a experience that was. Nawwar Allahu the qubur of these ajilla, wallahi, subhanallah, amazing. And then we ended at the Sharh al-Aqā'id, and in that we had munadhara and falsafa, hikmah. We did falsafa mu'asara and qadima, etc. That was all pinning in, and all of that was to get us to the Sharh al-Aqā'id and to have an experience with that Sharh al-Aqā'id. That's what it was. So these curricula, I think the curricula they have in the Ma'qulat, and one day maybe we'll do a separate one on the Farangi Mahal and the curriculum. I know you've got something in the pipeline for that anyway, and people can see the wisdom of why they chose their books. Because look, I explained it. Sanusi, Tamheed, Ash'ari, Maturidi, introductions down, yes? Then Ma'alim and Iqtisād, Razi and Ghazali, two of the most important thinkers. You got those two schools, and they're important because, remember, it's from the Razian paradigm that you're going to get the Wani. And Razi comes out of a Ghazalian paradigm. And I'll show you links for that. It's not for this today because we're talking about Maturidis, but I'll show you the links between them, yeah, in terms of teachers, yeah, and how they actually come out of each other. And then you get to the Sharh al-Aqā'id, now it's all tahqiqat.
This is so important because I want to throw this point out because it's so important to understand that these geniuses who put these curricula together, each step of the way there was a wisdom for why they added that book in that place. Now what happens is when you sometimes move books around in the curricula, or you begin to remove a certain book, then it leaves a hole and a gap in that tadarruj of that student. So there's something that
unless you know what you're doing, of course. Unless you know what you're doing. If you know what you're doing, and if you're mashayikh yourself, and they feel like, for here we're gonna pick this curriculum and this suits a certain circumstance or what we want to achieve. Because remember, the curriculum is there to achieve the student that you want. So for example, look.
I mean, specifically here I'm talking about making a mutakallim, making someone
That's
who's
different.
strong in Kalām and someone who's gonna, obviously.
Yeah. So for example, if you want your student to be a great ma'quli scholar, naturally you're gonna have a heavier. Like for example, there's a period in Istanbul where we had 4 ma'ahid at that time, right? And you make dua for them. It's not easy right now with residency and stuff like that. So make dua for our teachers there, right? But when students would come, and they'd ask me, which ma'had should I join? I would tell them, what do you want? Because if you want to specialize in fiqh, then go to Abu Hanifa. If you want to have a more of a stronger focus on aqliyat, go to Dar al-Funun. If you want to have more of a general, maybe go to Sheikh Ali Khalsa. If you want to have, again, a good focus on fiqh, but with this, go to Ma'ad al-Fatih with our Sheikh Shimah Dahla, etc. So, like for example, a student comes to me and says, look, I don't really want to go to all the Islamic studies curriculum. I've done this is what I've done, and but I want to focus on aqliyat, right? But I've done like fiqh and I've done that, etc., etc. I just want to go to Ikan. Do you focus on the ma'qulat? My point is that it depends on what the product is that you want at the end. So I'm not against the changing of curricula per se, but it's what are you trying to achieve? If you say I want to achieve mutakallimun from my madrasa, then naturally you're going to look for the greatest ma'qulat books. Then you're going to look at who did it the best, and you're going to look and you're going to say, oh yeah, these.
It was the Farangi Mahallis.
It was the Farangi Mahallis.
Nuruddin Sabuni.
No.
So you have obviously.
So he wrote al-Kifāyah min al-Hidāyah. So he's saying Hidayah is the Quran and Sunnah, and he gave you al-Kifāyah. What is yakfi for you, sufficient for you. And then from the Kifāyah, he made al-Bidāyah min al-Kifāyah.
Right.
So he's saying that from that Kifāyah, this is the Bidāyah. Start with this book, and the Kifāyah is, the Bidāyah is where like I said, we finished it, bihamdillah ta'ala, and I regret it. Like I'm very honoured to have taught that book, but I regretted it a little bit into it because it was so wordy. It's not your typical matan. Whereas had I done maybe a tamheed, then it would have been more for me to add on. Whereas with al-Bidāyah, it was, yes, I can add on, but he just spent so long in the text that by the time you finished reading the text, there's not so much time for you to give a commentary. If that makes sense? Because otherwise what will happen with the text like that is, if you were to still break it down bit by bit by bit by bit in the way that you would like to, perhaps from that sort of Mandialwi, sort of Khairabadi tradition or pedagogy of teaching, you're going to be on that book for the next 3 years. So in order for you to get that book done and to move on, let's say, to the Sharh al-Aqā'id, you want to sort of get that done in a reasonable amount of time. It's hard to do that and still teach the way that you want to teach it.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
Which hits my point home again that, these geniuses who put these curricula together did it for a very specific maqsad.
Yeah, it's true.
Each book was for a specific maqsad.
The reason, by the way, if I could just put it there, the reason why I chose al-Bidāyah at that time is because it was one of the last books written in that period.
Sure.
And the students that I had, we want to swim in Maturidi Kalām, we don't want nothing else.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So for me, it was, okay, then yalla namshi naqra al-Sabuni min al-Bidāyah ila al-Nihāyah, right? Let's read the whole book. You would have seen all of those discussions in that. And don't forget, al-Sabuni, by the way, al-Sabuni, there's me defending why I chose the book, yeah? But don't forget, but by the way, al-Bidāyah is taught in the Ottoman tradition.
Interesting.
So I have the need for it.
Interesting.
Yeah, just in case you do i'tiraz on me there, yeah? I have a job for it. Which, in the Ottoman tradition, the Bidāyah is taught of al-Sabuni.
Interesting.
Now, it's not as wordy as I'm making out to be.
Interestingly, some ulama will consider it a very medium-sized book as well.
It is a medium, I'm saying wordy. I didn't say heavy.
Okay.
It's not a heavy book. Yeah. He uses more words than your average matter. This is my experience. It's not a tanqeed in the book. Hasha wa kalla la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah ala rasi wal aini. Wallahi, no. I'm just saying, for me, as a teacher, my style of teaching, that was wordy for me. Yeah. I want 3 words, and I want to pull out all of the discussion. Like the EG course is going to come out now, inshallah ta'ala, right? With the Khairabadi Institute. A small matan like that, yallah, I love it. Why? Because now I get to have fun with it. I get to pull out all of the arguments and the isharat from it, right? I don't want that done for me, because then we're just reading a book, aren't we? And I don't mind that, because it will make my job easier in terms of preparing my lesson. but at the same time, I want to be able to bring in mawad. Now, with as-Sabuni also, what you have to remember of why it's so important is, and also, can I say, if there's an odd, strange person, I've not really had it, where somebody says, well, the Maturidi is not really much of a tradition. It was enough of a tradition for al-Imam al-Razi to leave Afghanistan, to go into Central Asia, to debate with them.
Right.
Now, as you know in Munadhara from Rashidiyya, that are you allowed to debate somebody that is not on your mustawa? No, it's haram to do so, isn't it? It's haram. You are not allowed to debate with somebody that is not on your mustawa. It has to be on your mustawa. So for al-Razi, and al-Razi huwa man huwa, as we'll say again, there is no thani for Razi. Yeah. For al-Razi to go and debate them and then write a book on his debates, right? And it can be very harsh. But then that's the style of writing. You know, these were people when you met them personally, they yatlif or yutlaf. But this is academia, this is ilm. They don't take any prisoners. Why? Because the ilm is important to them. You are not important to them. Yeah. Their allegiance and loyalty is to the ilm, not to the sahib of the ilm. Yes. That's an important thing to understand with these ulama. So anyway, he went and he stayed. And interestingly, he stays in the house of a Sabuni.
And debate Sabuni as well.
Debates. No, they had many debates. Yeah, read the book. It's a lengthy book. It's very interesting. Very. You'll enjoy reading it. It's a nice read. Yes, and you learn a little bit about the personality of Fakhruddin al-Razi rahmatullah. Now, what he says is interesting. Now, al-Razi was someone like, you remember as-Suyuti famously said, Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, there is no one in the West and East that has more knowledge of hadith than me. Now look, if you and I said that, we couldn't get away with it. Yeah, we couldn't say something like that statement because we couldn't substantiate that with evidence, right? It'd be a lie. Whereas for Suyuti to say, "Hada haqqu," yeah, this is haqq because he is who he is. Yeah, muhaddith azim. So sometimes ulama, they knew their value. This was never takabbur from their part.
Right.
They knew their value. They're very, very aware of what their maqam was. And you know what? Again, this was adab of their mansab. I mean, people don't get this sometimes. It was adab of their mansab, that the mansab that I have requires me to acknowledge what I have.
Yeah, of course.
So, but what does Imam Al-Razi say? Imam Al-Razi says about al-Sabuni, he says, I didn't find, he's saying this, says Razi can say this, yeah? He says, I didn't find from amongst them a mutakallim. The best that they had was al-Sabuni. So, but you know, what that tells you is that al-Sabuni was a great mutakallim.
Yeah, no,
Yeah. That's what that tells you.
Actually, just to finish off this last...
There's more. Usuluddin of al-Ghaznawi. Can I just read the names?
Yeah, Ghaznawi.
Usuluddin of al-Ghaznawi, Badul Amali of al-Ushi, Manzumat Aqā'id al Aḍudīyyah by Imam Zada, and Lubab al-Kalām al-Asmandi. These are all books that are written in this period that you can say can come to the end of this period of at-Tabayun. There's clear distinguishment between al-Maturidiyya and al-Ash'arīah.
So this is also true for the likes of Muhammad as-Samarqandi, who came at the end of the 7th century into the 8th century. You have the likes of obviously the scholar we're talking about, obviously who's Rukunuddin Samarqandi, that you find in this period there is this cross mazhab contrastive approach. But what you do find is that there are ulama earlier on, like Pazdawi, who began to do this, began to bring in aspects of Ash'arī discourse into Maturidi Kalām and Maturidi discussions. But where it really kicks off is in this 8th century, like you mentioned.
So you got that Tafahum period where there's really an overlap of ideas now.
Right.
Perhaps more talaqi.
That's right, yeah.
I think a lot of this is happening in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this period, so you could argue from around 700 until about 900 that you've got this. Now look at the books in this period.
What's this period called? Mazd, right?
So Mazj. So you had a Takween, you had a Tabayun, you had a Tafahum, and now you got Mazj.
Interesting.
This is your 4th period.
Interesting.
So again, a Takween is the formulation. The Tabayun is where they're very distinct. A Tafahum is where there's talaqi, There's a sort of getting to know each other, and then there's a mazj, which is where there's an overlapping where they don't consider each other to be separate
Anymore, right?
So here you've got, for example, Umdatul Aqā'id, Sharh al-Umda, li Abi Barakat al-Nasafi. So Abu Barakat al-Nasafi is, obviously very important from the Nasafis. You've got Tasdid, Sharh al-Tamheed, Saghnaqi. You've got Ta'adil al-Kalām li Sadr al-Shari'a. Now look, again, go to the Usul al-Fiqh books. Yeah. So what we call Tawzī wa Talwīh, in Dars al-Nizami. This matan with its sharh, both written by Sadr al-Shari'a.
That's right.
Yeah, al-Hanafi al-Māturīdī, rahimahullah ta'ala. He writes Ta'adil al-Kalām. It has 3 parts. We only have 1 part in print today. Again, Allah bless the text that brought that out. And again, so look at his Usul al-Fiqh works. In the trajectory of Usul al-Fiqh, they consider this to be the period of al-Jama'. Jam'u al-Tariqatayn, as they call it, which is between the Fuqaha tradition and the Ahlul Hadith tradition, or what they call Tariqat al-Mutakallimin and Tariqat al-Fuqaha, which can also be called Tariqat Hanafiyyah and Tariqat al-Shafi'iyyah.
Right.
Yeah. Then you get this period, same period, and this is where like al-Tahrir is being written by Ibn Humām.
That's right.
This is where al-Tawdīh wa Talwīh is being written by Sadr al-Shari'a. And look, the Tanqīh is written by
Sadr al-Shari'a.
The Talwīh is written by Taftazani, rahimahullah ta'ala. Again, makes sense, because he's writing with the Sharh al-Aqā'id as well.
That's right.
So you've got this muhaqqiq that sometimes chooses positions between the Ash'arī and al-Māturīdīyyah, writing the commentary on Umar al-Nasafis.
Nice.
You've got the Shuruh al-Aqīdah al-Tahawiyya, like al-Turkistani, al-Ghaznawi, al-Qunawi, al-Babarti. You've got Sharh Wasiyyat Abi Hanifa by al-Babarti again. You've got Sharh al-Aqā'id al-Taftazani.
Nice.
Now, moving on as well very quickly, you've got the Manzuma Jawahir al-Aqā'id li Khizr Bey. You've got Sharh al-Khayali al-Nuniyya.
Nice.
And you've got the Musāyarah of Ibn Humām. Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment.
That's right. Can I just jump in there and
Sure.
begin with Abu al-Barakat Abdullah Nasafi? Now he's got his Sharh al-Umda fi Aqidat Ahl al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which is also known as al-i'timād fil i'tiqād. What's going on here?
No, it's the same thing. My point is that when you're looking at the language of these books, a better example of that is going to be the Musāyarah.
Yeah, nice. We'll go into that.
That's going to be the better example of it. But the point is that here you can see that they're not. I'll give you one thing to note. They're not speaking polemically
anymore.
Yeah,
Nice.
they're not writing about the Ash'arī as they are a different firqa. No, they're writing about it as if this is a different flavor of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah.
Nice. Interestingly, Abu al-Barakat is an ardent defender of Ibn Arabi,
Yes, he is. Yeah.
Shaykh al-Akbar.
No.
And for those people who've studied the Dars al-Nizami tradition, he's obviously the author of Kanz al-Daqā'iq as well in Hanafi fiqh.
Absolutely. And like in Nablus, you're going to see he's a defender of Shaykh al-Akbar. And when we get to the Farangi Mahallis, obviously
That's
they
right,
are all.
So also we have in this period Tajuddin al-Subki.
The Nuniyya.
The Nuniyya. So Qāsid al-Nuniyya fil ikhtilāf bayn al-Ash'arī wal-Māturīdī. What's happening over here?
So look, the next period after this, from 900 and onwards, you could say, is a period where they are speaking about khilafiyat, where they're trying to redefine what it means to be a Maturidi, what it means to be an Ash'arī. There's a redefinition being taken place in that period. That's the 5th period. But when Shaykh al-Islam al-Subki writes the Nuniyya, he's writing it as look, we're the same.
Nice.
He's writing it as not a khilaf, but as a comparative.
Nice.
As what we have in common. Yeah, what we have in common. So when a Subki writes a Nuniyya, that's his objective in it.
So he actually documents 6 meaningful differences, and then he says 7 of those 7 other differences are terminological or semantic differences between both schools. Quick question for the audience: was he Maturidi or Ash'arī?
Shaykh al-Islam Tajuddin al-Subki. Shafi'i.
Yeah. But interesting.
As I said to you before, you can't take them all.
What's interesting though, he himself and his father, because this is Ibn al-Subki, right? Himself, he and his father took a number of Maturidi positions. So that's interesting to show you, to further manifest this period of masjid.
Absolutely. And look at Taftazani. Like I gave the example last time, that should ilm be defined. Obviously, many of the mutakallimun don't say it can be defined because it's amar badihi. But should it be defined? The 2 famous definitions that are given by al-Allāmah Taftazani he prefers the definition of the Maturidis,
Nice.
doesn't he?
Nice.
Like, but he's considered to be a Shafi'i Ash'ari.
Nice.
But really, because he's a muhaqqiq, this is why
This is you're talking about
Taftazani.
Taftazani.
Yeah.
Although I did read somewhere that Abdul Fattah Ghudda calls him
Yeah.
Maturidi,
Yeah, yes.
but he does adopt several positions of the Ash'arīs inside the Sharh al-Aqā'id.
Man huwa al-Maturidi. You know? Who's a Maturidi? Yeah.
Naam. And then obviously we're going into the 9th century again in this period of Majd. We have Ibn Humām.
So he's really interesting.
al-Musāyarah fil Aqā'id al-Munjiyah fil Akhirah.
Now, again, this is Egypt. Look, let me show you. You know, there are other prints here that are more, but, you know, call me old-fashioned, but I really like the Pakistani prints as well,
Nice,
yeah?
nice.
And but what I want to say off the offshoot, look at this, yeah? So, al-Musāyarah fil Aqā'id al-Munjiyah fil Akhirah, this is written by al-Kamal, Ibn Humām,
Yes, right.
rahmatullah alayh. One thing interesting to know about Ibn Humām is he is not only a faqih, but he's a muhaddith.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why even in the later books of Iftar in the Hanafi school, they don't have an i'timad per se on the tafarrudat of Ibn Humām, as they don't upon the tafarrudat of Mullah Ali Qari. So on his, you know, al-Inayah, for example, there are positions that he adopts that, for example, Ibn Abidin al-Shami would say, no, you know. And even, for example, also the Shari al-Bukhari, Badruddin Aini, specifically mentions in the books of fatwa that we don't have i'timad on their positions, they're tafarrudat. Why? Because they were, again, this was a deep period of masj. And I can give you some examples from their fiqh as well, by the way, but let's not go into that. What I want to highlight about this is, one is, already understand this is Egypt. This is a period where there is a lot of talaqi between Shafi'is and Hanafis. They are living side by side. They are teaching in the same
I
madaris.
mean, Ibn Hajar is in that period. Badruddin Aini is in that period. They actually say about Ibn Humām that he was the marji of fiqh as in that period, as Ibn Hajar and Badruddin Aini would have been the return points for hadith.
Hadith, no, absolutely. And but look, al-Musāyarah is here. Look at the sharh on it. Al-Musāyarah is by who? Is by Ibn Abi Sharif.
That's right.
Ibn Abi Sharif is a Shafi'i. He's a student. He's his student, but he is a Shafi'i Ash'ari. Yeah. And look at the Hashiyah is by Qutl Bugha, also a student. So Qutl
Student of Ibn Humām.
Ibn Humām. So Qutl Bugha is a student. Well, he's the one that's saying that we don't follow the Shaykh in his tafarrudat.
Interesting.
No, why I mentioned that, sorry, is you've got a book in Kalām where one commentary is by a Shafi'i and one commentary is a Maturidi. That tells you how it works. But Ibn Humām was a Maturidi.
Right.
But where he could, and this is why it's Mazj, where he could synthesize, he synthesized. And if you like, I'll give you an example from it as well.
That's nice, yeah. Yeah, off you go, please.
Oh, Bismillah, yeah, okay, I'll give you an example.
I think it was Tasdeeq bil Qalb, wasn't it?
Now, so for example,
So some people who will say that this book is a synthesis between Ash'ari Maturidi positions. We would say yes, in that number one is an ikhtisar of a Ash'ari book, which is essentially the ikhtisar of Imam Ghazali's Risala Qudsiyya, isn't it? And then secondly, in that, there are certain positions where he will basically provide some sort of a synthesis between the Ash'ari school. But as a disclaimer, he is Maturidi.
yes,
But he's in the period of Majd.
Naam. And you know, that's Jazakumullah khairan. That's a great point. I mean, if you like, you can talk about that, the idea of this, of the Musāyarah itself. What was it? What was the intention behind it, and then what happened to it?
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
Tafaddal, I think.
I mean, while you're looking for that masala, of course, yeah. So he wrote this book as an ikhtisar and an abridgment of a Risala Qudsiyya of Imam al-Ghazali. And then later on, what he did was he added some idafat and some additional points, and then it ended up becoming a mustaqil book in itself. But if you look at the book, its layout is like the Risala Qudsiyya. So you have the muqaddimah, you have a khatima, then you have 4 arkan in between, and each rukn has 10 usul. So it's a fantastic work. And inshallah, just as a disclaimer, while Maulana's taking that point out, inshallah, at the Khairabadi Institute, we will be looking at some aspects of the ilahiyat sections, inshallah, of the Musāyarah, inshallah. As a course
on that,
inshallah. Yeah, there'll be a course. And that we look forward to, inshallah, very soon on that, inshallah.
Inshallah. Now, so as you say, he intended for it to be an ikhtisar of al-Risala al-Qudsiyah, but because he added so much to it, it just became an independent book itself. But the asal is still there. That's why I gave it a different name. But look, for example here, look what he does here. I'm saying it gives you an insight into what he's doing. So he says, this is in the fi mafhum al-iman. So just a quick backdrop. For al-Ash'arīah, what is al-iman? It is at-tasdiq bil-qalb faqat. What is iman for the Maturidis? It is at-tasdiq bil-qalb wal-iqraru bil-lisan. So you have to testify with your tongue. Now, so that's a difference, isn't it? What Ibn Humām is trying to do here is he's trying to say there's no difference. So he's saying semantical. Or you understand it in this way, like ziyadah fil iman, they do the same thing with ziyadah fil iman, don't they? So he says, some people disagree with it. But that's a different discussion. He says, أما النظر الأول فقيل هو التصديق بالقلب فقط وهو المختار عند جمهور الأشاعرة أو مع الطاعة وهو قول الخوارج. So that's a whole different discussion about the Khawarij. And he said, وَلِذَا كَفَرُوا بِالذَّنْبِ لِانْتِفَاءِ جُزْءِ الْمَاهِيَةِ. Because if amal is a juz of the mahiyah of iman, if it is a part of the essence of iman, well, if you don't have amal, you're a kafir.
That's right.
Because if you don't have the juz, you don't have the kull.
Which they said.
Which they said, of course, that's what he pointed. And he says, أو باللسان فقط, or it's just with the tongue, which is a really odd position. وهو قول الكرامية.
Which will make you munafiq.
Exactly. So here he says, وإلا فهو مؤمن مخلد في النار. أو بالقلب واللسان, or it is بالقلب واللسان, يعني معا. وهو منقول عن أبي حنيفة رحمة الله عليه. ومشهور عن أصحابه وبعض المحققين من الأشاعرة. So some of the muhaqqiqeen from the Ash'arīs say this, but this is what's mashhur from him, and this is the position generally of the Maturidis. قالوا لما كان الإيمان هو التصديق والتصديق كما يكون بالقلب يكون باللسان فيكون كل منهما ركنا في الباب فلا يثبت الإيمان إلا بهما إلا عند العجز وكذا الاحتياط واقع عليه والنصوص دالة عليه وذكروا ما تعلقت به الكرامية من. So he's gone into a different discussion, but look what he's saying here. So he's made that point, but there's a point where he does tawfiq between the two, and he says, "Naam." Yeah, he says. So he says, "Al-iman lil-qalb wal-kufr أيضا بقوله." He's referring to a verse from before. وهو محل اتفاق بين الفريقين. No one disagrees about that, right? About تصديق بالقلب between al-Ash'arīah and al-Maturidiyah. He's highlighting that point. فوجب كون الإيمان بهما وهو الاحتياط. He goes, so احتياط would be that you have iman of both. إلا أن قول صاحب العمدة منهم الإيمان هو التصديق فمن صدق الرسول فيما جاء به عن الله فهو مؤمن فيما بينه وبين الله تعالى. So now he's bringing out a different discussion. He's saying, look, someone that has tasdiq bil qalb, there is no denying that that person is a mu'min بينه وبين الله. والإقرار أي باللسان شرط إجراء الأحكام. In order for you to have the ahkam, like for example, as I say, can you marry this person? If they're not Muslim, or if they're Muslim, that changes. What about at-taghsil wa at-takfin wa at-tadfin when they die? What about the irth, the taqsim of their wealth when they die, inheritance? What about washing them? What about shrouding them in the kafan? What about burying them? Do you pray over them? And he says, وهو بعينه القول المختار عند الأشاعرة والمراد أحكام الدنيا من الصلاة خلفه ودفنه في مقابر المسلمين وغير ذلك. And he said, واتفق القائلون بعدم اعتبار الإقرار على أن يعتقد أنه متى طولب به أتى به فإن طولب به. This is going into a different discussion. But the point that he mentions here is when they say al-iqraru bil-qalb, what they mean is بينه وبين الناس. And I think he mentions that. إقرار باللسان. I think he mentions that somewhere. In any case, I'll summarize it for the sake of time. But what he basically is saying is that when you say tasdiq bil-qalb, no one's denying that is an iman بينه وبين Allah. So when they say we don't accept it, the Maturidis, he's saying, He's saying when the Maturidis say no, the Ash'arīs say no, what they mean is al-iman baynahu wa bayna al-nas. They're not denying baynahu wa bayna Allah, between him and between Allah. And when the Maturidis say no, al-iqraru bil-lisan, what they mean is baynahu wa bayna al-nas. So are they saying anything different? So now, if you from the i'tibar of baynahu wa bayna Allah, if I was to say to you, what is al-iman? You would say at-tasdiq bil-qalb. Right? Whereas if I was to say to you from the i'tibar of, do we know he's a Muslim for ijra' al-ahkam, then what would you say? You said we have to have iqrar bil-lisan. How do we know? We judge on the zahir, don't we? And on the zahir he's a kafir. So we won't pray over him, we won't wash him in a Muslim way, and we won't bury him in a Muslim graveyard because he's a kafir. But if I said to you, is he a kafir in the akhirah? You'd say, Wallahu a'lam, because you're saying he was a Muslim, but I don't know that. But it could be that baynahu wa bayna Allah was a mu'min. Because what Ibn Humām is saying, I'm not saying that this is the asl of Abu Hanifa's qawl. I'm not saying that. I'm saying what he's trying to achieve here. Is he's saying that when the Maturidis say al-iqraru bil-lisan, what they mean is baynahu wa bayna nas. And when the Ash'arīs say at-tasdiq bil-qalb faqat, what they mean is baynahu wa bayna Allah. So from that i'tibar they're correct, from this i'tibar they're correct.
Okay, so moving on to the 900s to the 1000, which is a period of about 100 years. We have a period which you mentioned was called إيضاح al-Masā'il al-ikhtilāfiyyah. So this is a period where they making note of those ikhtilafat, and they're putting out those ikhtilafat of what it means to be Maturidi as opposed to an Ash'ari. So is there any famous works in this period and famous scholars, notable scholars in this period that are documenting these kind of differences?
Now, this period, as you say, إيضاح al-Masā'il, it's a very important period with, for example, the likes of Ibn Kamal Pasha, Shaykh Zada, they're writing books on khilafiyat. So that's something quite new. Whereas before it's ittifaq, isn't it? Like you use the word, you entitled yourself. So Ibn Kamal Pasha, again, like it's not as great as Shaykh Zada's book, but Ibn Kamal Pasha was very important. Shaykh al-Islam, made his Tawbah in Sophia, left his political career, rose to the ranks of Shaykh al-Islam, genius mind. He wrote that book, as you mentioned, it's translated into English as well. Sheikh Saeed Fawda has his tahqiq on it, and I think he adds some notes to it. Shaykh Zada's Nazm al-Fara'id is probably the more popular. There are books in the later period that we'll talk about that perhaps you can sort of put in here, but these are like independently written for that purpose.
Nice.
And something with Nazm al-Fara'id as well is that the author almost looks for differences.
Yeah, he's seeking them out.
Seeking them out. Like for example, on the first masala on wujud, like he'll say, even though it's not, like he'll say, oh, is the zat wujud or is the zat muqtadiya lil wujud? Is it mafhumain? And he will document that as a difference between the Ash'arī and Maturidiyya, whereas really, I mean, it's like a umum khusus min wajh sort of relationship here, because it's ba'd al-Ash'arī and ba'd al-Maturidiyya. So he's really trying to highlight those differences between the two
nice.
schools.
So we have obviously Shaykh Zada. So just for the audience, the name of the book is Kitab Nazm al-Fara'id wa Jam' al-Fawa'id بين المسائل التي وقع فيها الاختلاف بين المعتوريدي والأشاعرة في الاعتقاد.
It's a paragraph, yeah.
MashaAllah. So interesting. They do say apparently he didn't write the book. There was another Shaykh Zada from Gallipoli in the Ottoman Empire, but Allah knows best about that. So now we're moving on to the 1000s. Just before we move on to the thousands, I did read somewhere that apparently the Ottomans themselves used to call themselves Ash'arī.
Yeah.
So what kind of Maturidis were the Ottomans?
No, they were Maturidis, but again, look, it's I can read from you from the Farangi Mahallis where they use the same language.
Interesting.
Where it wasn't when they said, when they would say that they're Ash'ari, they didn't mean that they're not Maturidi. They just used them the same. I'm going to read this quote because I knew this was going to come up. And so I want to read this quote to you. Yeah. Now this is, and we'll talk more about him maybe in a bit, but this is Mullah Nidhamuddin al-Sihalwi. This is the founder, arguably, of the Dars al-Nizami curriculum and that tradition. So that's a hugely important person. So he has a hashia on Dawani, on the Aqā'id of al Ījī, which is, it's still in manuscript. and even its part manuscript. It's not even the full manuscript. But look what he says here. For example, this. You will know what the Ottomans meant. This is what they meant. The same thing the Farangi Malis meant.
Nice.
He says, you remember in the Aqā'id, the section where he talks about the saved sect, right at the beginning, yeah? He says, وَهُمْ الْأَشَّاعِرَةِ وَمَنْ هُوَ فِي طَبَقَتِهِمْ كَالْمَاتُرِدِيَّةِ.
Nice.
That's what they meant. So look, well, he's a Maturidi Hanafi. He should have just said, وَهُمْ الْمَاتُرِدِيَّةِ وَالْأَشَّاعِرَةِ. You'd expect him to say that. But he recognized that the Ash'ari, the school of al-Ash'ari, meaning that name, is more dominant than Maturidi. It's more widespread. Put it this way, when you say the word Ash'ari, everyone knows what you mean, even in Egypt, even in North Africa, everyone knows what that means.
Right.
ومن هو في طبقة كالماتريدية فإنها لا يتخالفان إلا في بعض الفروع التي لا يفسق به أحدهما الآخر. No one makes tafsiq of the other because of this. فنجاة was my favorite line. فنجاة أحدهما توجب نجاة الآخر.
MashaAllah.
If one is saved on Yawm al-Qiyamah, the other one is saved because they are the same thing.
في طبقتهم.
في طبقتهم.
MashaAllah.
That's what they meant.
Nice.
No.
Okay, so moving on to the thousands. After the thousands and after, we have a new phase in an era in Maturidi Kalām, which is an era of redefinition. So this is a period where you begin to see more of a focus again on what it means to be a Maturidi, as opposed to Mazj. But having said that, Mazj does continue,
Of course, yes.
because we have obviously Allama Nablusi in this period again. But we do have the likes of Mullah Ali Qari with his Minā al-Azhar. So can you just briefly explain to us Mullah Ali Qari's Minā al-Azhar, which is Sharafik al-Akbar?
Well, you see a reappearance of al-Fiqh al-Akbar. That in and of itself is important. There's a reappearance of the book. Why is it in all of those generations before him? Why was there no commentary? Why was Ibn Humām doing an ikhtisar of al-Risala al-Qudsiyya of al-Ghazali, al-Shafi'i, al-Ash'ari, and not of al-Fiqh al-Akbar? So there was a sort of an i'timad upon that original Imam. It's like a redefinition that's taking place. So you get, for example, Ibn Bahauddin Zada from the Ottomans writing al-Qawl al-Faẓl, beautiful commentary on al-Fiqh al-Akbar. You get like the Badr al-Amali commentary by Mullah Ali Qari.
Dawl Ma'ali.
Naam. You get Sharh al-Nuniyya li Dawood al-Qarisi.
Nice.
So for example, you've got this where there's a focus. It's like the matan is Maturidi and the Shari is Maturidi.
Nice. But then, just to add to that, Mazj still continues.
Of course.
So you got Allama Nablusi who wrote Tahqiq al-Intisar fi ittifaq al-Ash'ari wal-Maturidi ala khalqi ikhtiyar. So in this work, he's basically saying that the both schools are one of the same thing.
Yeah.
So although this is a period of redefinition, but you also have Mazd continuing as well. And interestingly,
and like Isharatul Maram, that's a good example of where it's a book that he's writing, but he's highlighting the khilafiyat between the two, but not in a polemical way.
Interesting.
Yeah, just almost in an academic way.
Nice. Interestingly, he also wrote Wūrūd al-Haq, in which he defends Shaykh al-Akbar, entirely based upon the Ash'ari doctrine of al-Wujud Ayn al-Zat. This is interesting, where you see this again, this Mazj happening between both schools. Then obviously, carrying on in the 12th century, you have Mullah Nizamuddin As-Sihalwi. Now this is interesting because this goes on to my initial, you could say division of eras. This was your third period, where you have this continuation of Maturidi Kalām taking place in a period where one is that there's a redefinition, but there's also Mazj continuing as well. So let's try to find that in Mullah Nizamuddin As-Sihalwi.
Look here, for example, when Jibreel al-Haddad, Hafidhahullah, Sheikh Jibreel al-Haddad, when he wrote his book al-Maturidi, he mentions like al-Alama Badayuni, I believe, in the book. But he's going to Sheikh Zayed al-Kawthari, isn't he, right? Because he's focusing on what texts were produced. This, like, subhanallah, look how amazing this is. We talked about this in the previous podcast, about the development in the Farangi Mahal was largely in their commentaries and hawashi. Their independent ideas and discussions and developments were found in the shuruh and hawashi. That's what they did.
That's right.
So now, what we need to add on to that sort of work is, well, like you said, Mullah Nizamuddin. Like, as an example, let me give you an example of Mullah Nizamuddin.
So just to make a point over here as well, is that we're in the 12th century, so there's a period of redefinition, but also masjid. We see with Nizamuddin Sihalawi is that you see commentaries in that region, the subcontinent, on Ashʻarī books by Maturidi scholars. So again, that's a masjid as well in a way, a type of masjid.
Who like al-Dawani? Where do you put Jalaluddin al-Dawani? Yes, these are now that period. Remember we talked about this last time in the previous podcast. This is a period that it's hard to put them in a box like that. They are Ash'ari, absolutely, but there's a lot of introduction of hikmah into the works of theology at this point.
Yeah, which period are you talking about?
Like Mullah Dawani's period, for example. Yeah.
Right.
Now this is a commentary on Dawani.
Nice.
But look at what he says here. For example, he says, "Li'anna." I hope that when you do this, you put this. I'll send the section. Put this up so people could read it for themselves. Right. It's unfortunate that these are still in manuscript. You know, one day inshallah, you know, may Allah Ta'ala make it so we can bring the books of the Farangi Mahal out. People think that the books of the Farangi Mahal are only the ones in the Dars al-Nizami curriculum that are being circulated. They don't know. They haven't touched the tip of what the Farangi Mahal is produced in terms of books. Each one of them, you talk about the Sulam al-Ulum, they'll quote to you, your Bahr al-Ulum, you know, Alhamdulillah, Mullah Mubin maybe, you know, Qazi Mubarak, Alhamdulillah, that's it. There's 100 commentaries on the Sulam alone.
That's right.
Yeah.
Each one's bringing something new.
You know, each one of them had their Hashiyah Mullah Dawani. Why? Because they all taught it. So when they taught it, they had their, basically it's their taqreed.
That's right.
It's basically their taqreed and their tahqiqat. And they taught all of the books. And so now, you know, we haven't touched the surface of these people. So look what he says here. This is Mullah Nizamuddin al-Sihalvi, the muassis of Dars al-Nizami. He says, لأن الماتريدية, so he's talking about the issue of tahsin wa taqbih, moral ontology. There's an age-old i'tirad that the Maturidis are like the Mu'tazila. Look how beautifully and how summarized he explains the masala. Firstly, let me read this bit. He says, لأن الماتريدية أيضا يقولون بعقلية الحسن والقبح. وهم وحالية whilst هم من حزب الأشاعرة. So whilst they are أشاعرة, يعني كيف يقولون هكذا that بعقلية الحسن والقبح الحسن والقبح العقليان, like how do they say that? So look what he says. He goes on, I'm going to skip a little bit and get to the lub of what he says. He says والتحقيق, you love it when they say that, والتحقيق قول القائل. What's the تحقيق؟ أن المعتزلة لما قالوا بالحسن والقبح العقليين في الفروع, that when the Mu'tazila say it, وادعوا أن القبح في الأفعال ملزوم. When they say it, they say that this is ملزوم لترتب العقاب, أنكروا الشفاعة للمذنبين. That they say it is ملزوم that person will be punished for doing something. Yes? So they do inkar of shafa'a lil-mudhnibin, of the intercession for the sinners. And the Prophet says, al-shafa'ati li-ahli al-kaba'ir min ummati. Right? Salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. And he says, wal-afu, and Allah's pardoning. وَأَوْجَبُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى تَعْذِيبَ الْمُذْنِبِ. And they make wajib upon Allah punishing the sinner. لأن اتباع النفس الأمر لأن اتباع نفس الأمر ضروري وانفكاك الملزوم عن اللازم ممتنع بالذات فيستحيل عليه تعالى. So because of that, they say you can't separate the two. Lazim and malzum can't be separated, and this is mustahil upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do that. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. How dare they say that? فأول بسبب ذلك, because of that, فأول النصوص المغفرة والشفاعة مع كونها نصوصا مفسرة محكمة غير قابلة لتأويلاتهم. So they ended up inkar of the nusus which were muhkam. There was no ihtimal for ta'wil aslan. There was no ihtimal for it. So how did they do it? Then he says, وَأَمَّا نَحْنُ مَعْشَرَ الْمَاتُرِيدِيَّةِ.
Nice. So this here, so Jumla Mu'tariza, is a sign where, because it's post 1000, that redefinition.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
They're still holding on to the fact that they are Maturidi, but the mazj could be here that this is a commentary on an Ash'ari book.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the kind of synthesis between these two ideas in that period.
Absolutely, and not just that, but when there's an i'tiraz against the Maturidis, they don't just turn around and say, yeah, the Maturidi wording was not correct by you saying aqliyayn. They should have said shar'iyayn, kal-Ash'arīah. They say, nah, whilst being in the hizb of al-Ash'arīah, let me defend the Maturidi position because I'm a Maturidi. That's what he's saying.
Nice.
So he says, وَأَمَّا نَحْنُ مَعَشْرِ الْمَاتُرِيدِيَّةِ فَإِنَّا وَإِنَّ قُولْ بِالْحُسْنِ وَالْقُبْحِ الْأَخْلِيَّيْنِ. He didn't deny that. Even though we do say بِالْحُسْنِ وَالْقُبْحِ, what do we say? لكن لا نقول باللزوم ترتب العقاب بل في القبح استحقاق ترتب العقاب إن شاء عاقب وإن شاء عفا بالشفاعة أو بدونهما. This is the Ash'ari position. He's saying that we do not say it's malzoom of Allah Ta'ala is going to punish a Muslim, or Allah Ta'ala is going to reward the muti'. No, there's no luzum between that. And he says if he wants, he can do what he wants. Or even if even if it's not with shafa'ah, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala can still forgive it. And he says, well, akhdhu bil adl, because they're ashab al-adl wa tawheed, aren't they, the mu'tazila, right? That's what they call themselves. He says, and Allah Ta'ala being just, wal afw, and pardoning, min al-karam, فالقول بالحسن والقبح العقليين على ما يقول المعتزلة يفضي إلى فساد أكثر العقائد الحقة. Their position of saying الحسن والقبح العقليين is إفساد of أكثر العقائد الحقة, true عقائد, ورد النصوص المفسرة, and it is a رد. نعم. ورد النصوص المفسرة, and it is rejecting clear and ambiguous نصوص بخلاف قولنا بعقلية الحسن والقبح, as opposed to how we mean when we say الحسن والقبح is عقليين. فافهم فإنه ملحق عزيز. So understand this. Yeah.
Nice.
Now that for me is a very clear a passage of where he is defining himself not only as a Maturidi, but he is beautifully defending the Maturidi position, whilst earlier he called himself an Ash'ari.
Nice.
Because he said the firqa najiyah is what? هم الأشاعرة ومن في طبقتهم كالماتريدية. So what did he call himself? Basically called himself an Ash'ari. And later on I've got a quote, if you like, I'll find it for you, where he actually says, called himself an Ash'ari, like we're the Ash'aris. So what you find with these is that they use that term interchangeably.
Follow on from that point, Mullah Nizamuddin obviously writes al-Sharʻa Musallam al-Thubut, Hanafi work, arguably a Maturidi work as well, so many aspects of Kalām in there. But then he obviously writes the Hashiyah ala Sharh al-Jalāliyah, which is again an Ash'ari work, and he also has a Hashiyah ala Hawashi Qadīma al-Dawāniyah as well, and many other works as well. Okay, in this period we have, going on to 13th century now, we have the likes of Allāmah Faẓl-i-Rasūl Badayuni rahimahullah, who writes the Mu'taqad al-Muntaqad. Is there anything you want to add there?
Well, we talked once, and you said something to me that really just, subhanAllah, is beautiful.
Nice.
And I'd like to hear that from you about the section about his tahqiq on the sifat being ayn al-dhat, and how he defends the position of the Sufis on that, and how they're different to i'tizāl, a bit like what here Mullah Nizamuddin defends the Maturidis against the Mu'tazila, how he on the sifat, the Ma'ani sifat, how he defends the Sufis, and how he does a type of synthesis there. That I want to hear from you.
Nice, inshallah. As I mentioned that, his work, because that point you mentioned is in the Mu'taqad.
Yeah.
Now, keeping in mind that Allāmah Badayuni's 13th century, he's obviously from the Uthmani lineage. What's interesting about his work as a Maturidi text is that the contents of the book, what you find in this period is interestingly is that the contents of the book go far beyond the traditional chapter headings of the Maturidi style. So you do find that his work gains many great taqāris. Amongst them is the likes of Allāmah Khairabadi rahimahullah, gives a taqreez on the work. You have the likes of Sadr al-Sudur, the Sadr al-Sudur of Delhi, who was obviously Sadruddin Khan Azurda rahimahullah, who writes taqreez. You have Maulana Haider Ali Faizabadi, who's a student of Shah Abdulaziz Muhaddis Dehlawi, the son of Shah Wali Allah, who writes a taqreez on the work. And it gains the work is widely accepted in the subcontinent. And Imam Ahmad Ridā Khan rahimahullah actually writes a hashia on the work later on, which is known as al-Mu'tamad al-Mustanad. Interestingly, this is the Farangi Mahal tradition, because he is a grandstudent of Bahr al-Ulum. He's Akbarian. He writes a commentary on the Fusus al-Hikam. And the point that you mentioned, which is very interesting, is that if you look at the works, the commentaries on Sulam al-Ulum, like Mullah Hassan rahimahullah, they have a discussion on ilm Bari Ta'ala, and they say that they mention that the ilm of Bari Ta'ala is Ainu Zat. Now, what you find here is that Alama Badayuni rahimahullah, he clarifies this point inside the Mu'taqad, and he explains how this position, which is the position of the Sufiya Safiya, you also find this position with the Mu'tazila, but he explains how they're different from each other, and it's not one and the same thing. So he actually mentions here, he says, Inna inkar ziyadati sifat, inkar li sifat. This is actually another scholar mentioning it. He says here, in the Mu'taqad, he says, وَالْحَاصِلْ أَنَّ الْقَائِلِينَ بِأَنَّ الصِّفَاتِ أَيْنُ ذَاتِهِ تَعَالَى طَائِفَتان. Those people who say that the sifat are the ain zat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, these are two groups, muhikka wa mubtila. Those who are on the haqq and those who are on misguidance. And he says, as for those who are the mubtila, he says, al-mu'tazila wal-falasifa la yu'minuna anna lahu ta'ala sifat za'ida ala zati ta'ala aqlan. They say they do not believe that the sifat are za'ida upon the sifat aqlan. Bal hiya aynu zatihi indahum aqlan. They say that it's aynu zat aqlan. Now, how does this differ from the Sufiya Safiya? How is what Mullah Hassan is saying inside his commentary Sulam al-Ulum different to what the Mu'tazila are saying? What he says, wal muhikka ahlul kamali min al-arifina fa innahum yaqulun. The ahlul haq, the ahlul kamal, and what did they say? They say inna lahu ta'ala sifat hiya aynu zat bin nazari ila al-amri ala ma huwa alayhi mimma la ya'lamuhu illa Allah ta'ala. That indeed for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are sifat, and they are aynu zat with nazar, with regards to the matter as it actually is from that which nobody knows except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَهِيَ غَيْرُ الزَّاتِ بِحَسَبِ النَّظَرِ الْأَقْلِ, and they غَيْرُ الزَّاتِ with regards to بِالنَّظَرِ الْأَقْلِ. So he says here, وَهُوَ مَحْضُ الْإِيمَانِ, and this is mahaz iman. This is iman itself. So this is incredible that you find these Farangi Mahalli ulama.
But he's not even that late. Like he's
13th century.
Yes, this is
Hijrah.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is incredible that you find this illustrious lineage of ulama in that period who are, you're seeing masjids continuing of the Maturidis and Ash'arīs, but also what you're finding here is, as Maturidis, there is a defense of the positions of the Sufiya Safiya.
Oh yes.
And this takes us on to our last scholar in this period, who is Allama Faẓl-i-Haq, Khairabadi rahimahullah, who obviously wrote the al-Wūrūd al-Mawjūd. He wrote Hashia on the Qādi Mubarak, which was a commentary on the Sulam al-Ulum of Gopamwi. And this was actually published in 1899. And then the book was republished again by Siyal Sharif, by Khwaja Qamaruddin Siyalawi rahimahullah, who's a great later Khairabadi scholar.
Akbarian scholar.
Can we just have a few moments, inshallah, on al-Road, and just explain to us via Road al-Mawjūd how Faẓl-i Khairabadi again is demonstrating for us that this is a period of redefinition where they are clearly establishing that they're Maturidi, but at the same time there is this imtizaj between the Sufiya Safiya and their positions.
So I'll give you an example in the Road al-Mawjūd. By the way, that section from the Mu'taqad, I just thought it was just the way he wrote it. It's absolutely beautiful. MashaAllah. Allah yajzik al-khair for that. So, like for example, Road al-Mawjūd, firstly, remember, is a book in which al-Allāmah Faẓl-i-Haq Khairabadi rahmatullah alayhi is trying to defend the position of Wahdat al-Wujud.
Nice.
Yeah? So many of the ulama, like Dawani has a Risala fil Wujud, Tashkir Pirzada, Ibn Baha'uddin, many of the ulama, they had this Risala fil Wujud.
That's right.
Yeah, where they're specifically speaking about this concept because it is such an important concept. So he also has a Rawd al-Majud, which we've been talking about, and etc. And very soon, inshallah, bi'idhnillah, the du'as of people, this will come out muhaqqaq, inshallah, and hopefully with the translation as well. The translation is less important, the tahqiq is more important. So inshallah, make dua for that. So he says, firstly about him being Maturidi. So remember, he wants to explain wujud. So the first thing he's going to do is say to you, he wants to say to you, this is an aqli affair for us. Why? Because he says that the Sufiya, Safiya, and I'm going to read that for you in a minute, that their level is a different level. Their level of understanding, they have access to knowledge that is beyond the level of the uqul mutawassita. Yeah? The level of the middle sort of uqul, the hukama, the philosophers. That mean the highest intellects that we can get to, that's mutawassit. Right? But the uqul aliyah, this is with kashf of the awliya. But he says, I'm not going to do that because I'm writing it for you. So he says, لما خلق الإنسان, and look at his dalil that he gives here. He says, لما خلق الإنسان لعبادة خلاقه. So when insan was made for the worship of his majestic creator, والتخلق بأخلاقه, and to manifest, I'm going to translate this my way, to be a madhar of Allah's sifat. وَرُزِقَ الْعَقْلُ لِمَعْرِفَةِ مَعْبُودِهِ. The aql was then honored, given the rizq, to be able to know the one who is the object of worship. وَالْإِيمَانِ بِوُجُودِهِ بِالنَّظَرِ فِي مَظَاهِرِ جُودِهِ. Beautiful style of writing, right? You know, because he doesn't just say the madahir of the madahir judihi, of his karam. And he says, وَلَمْ يُعْذَرْ فِي مَعْرِفَتِهِ مَنْ لَمْ يَبْلُغْ دَعْوَةُ الْأَنْبِيَاءِ عَلَيْهِمُ السَّلَامِ. This is Maturidi.
That's right.
That no one is ajiz. Why? Because the aql is sarih. And he says, عَلَى مَا أَعْتَقَدَهُ مَشَائِخُنَا al-Maturidiyah.
Nice.
Yes. So this is his affirming him being a Maturidi. الَّذِينَ هُمْ أَعْلَامُ أَهْلِ الْإِسْلَامِ. Yeah, these are the forerunners of Ahlul Islam. إِذْ الْعَقْلُ الصَّرِيحُ دَلِيلٌ كَافٍ عَلَى أَنَّهُ مَوْجُودٌ بِلَا مَكَافٍ. The aql, sarih, is a dalil, sufficient dalil, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in existence without any faltering. وَلَوْلَا, he says, that إِنَّ الْعَقْلَ أُسْوَةٌ فِي هَذَا الْمَرَامِ. The aql is an uswa. It's a perfect guide, so to speak, or role model in this matter. لازم إفهام الأنبياء عليهم الصلاة والسلام كما هو مشروح في كتب الكلام. فلكون العقل في هذا الباب قدوة وجب الإيمان بالمعبود وصفاته على من لم يسمع دعوة الأنبياء. Even the one that didn't hear it, it's wajib because of this. I'm going to translate this now. ولذا لم يجوز الإيمان بالتقليد. This is why تقليد is haram iman. This is why لا يجوز في علم الذات والصفات والتوحيد. ولذا دل بالدلائل العقلية على ذلك في الفرقان الحميد والقرآن المجيد. فقال عز من قائل سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق إلى آخر هذه الآية الشريفة. So that is his way of saying the aql is sarih, and I'm going to establish this through that upon the way of the Maturidis. But then he says this. That's really interesting. Yeah, he says now, but people may say, for example, and they do a tuhma, and they say, what about like the Sufis? Because the Sufis have access to this through different ways. And he says here, and he says that as for the and he talks about, he mentions about wahda, there's al-wadih alladhi la yunkar wa la yakhfa. Yeah, it's not rejected. We're not rejecting this, and there's not a hidden matter. And another كلما كان أدق وأصفى كان العلم والحاصل به أحق وأوفى. Yeah, so when another is adaq, more daqiq, وأصفى, and more pure, the ilm that is achieved through it is going to be with more tahqiq and more loyal to the truth. And he says, وَإِنَّ الصُّوفِيَّةَ, and the Sufis, الصَّافِيَّة, the Sufiya Safiya, أَدَّقُّ in that. I'm not going to read the whole section. It goes on for a good while, a few pages. of his beautiful style of writing. Remember, this is Sahib al-Diwan and he's a great poet, and don't forget all of those things, right? He says, the Sufis are addaqqu inzaran, they are the most daqiq in their nazar. Wa aqdasu israran, they're the most pure in their secrets. Allah. Wa aswabu afkaran, they're the most correct in all of their positions. Wa ashghalu bi rabbihim sirran wa jiharan, and they are the most preoccupied with their Lord in private and in the outward. And I can carry on, وَأَذْكَرُوا إِيَّاهُ لَيْلًا وَنَهَارًا, and they do the most amount of dhikr of Allah Ta'ala, only Allah Ta'ala, إِيَّاهُ, don't forget, إِيَّاهُ, لَيْلًا وَنَهَارًا, by night and day. وَأَطْوَعُ لَهُ إِنْقِيَادًا وَأَصْدَقُ بِهِ اِعْتِقَادًا وَأَخْلَصُ فِي طَاعَتِهِ نِيَّةً وَأَعْمَلُ فِي شَأْنِهِ رُؤْيَةً وَأَسَدُّ بِهِ إِيمَانًا وَأَشَدُّ بِهِ هِيمَانًا وَأَسْعَى إِلَيْهِ طَلَبًا Rahimahullah ta'ala. Like, wallahi. And then, but he says, but at the end, he goes on and says, but that is for them. I am not going to argue and speak. And in one place, he actually says, this is the ijma of the Sufis on this masala. And how do we fight with these people? We don't fight with them. But I'm going to explain it to you upon the aql sarih that is yakfi for you. So you can understand the masala. This, and I say this, I've said this before, and I'll say this 1,000 times more, that this is quintessentially the Farangi Mahal tradition.
Nice.
That's the essence. They are Sufis and they believe in that, and they've got to it. But their Kalamic writings, they will bring all of that into it. But they are Maturidis because they're Hanafis.
Exactly. So it's interesting that you see them redefining themselves. They're a part of the redefinition of what it means to be Maturidi. They're also in a period of Masjid as well, like the Wani's commentaries you see. But at the same time, they are there is an imtizaj.
Even yeah, exactly.
There's an imtizaj of the entire Sufi tradition.
Absolutely,
well.
And even it's like the it's a wonderful banquet.
It's a wonderful banquet.
And graze as you wish.
Yeah, that's nice.
That is the Farangi Mahal tradition.
So just in Kalām,
I have to say this: we are not, I am not, you are not salespeople for the Farangi Mahal tradition. We are, bifadlillahi ta'ala, in some small, short way, benefactors of some beauty that we tasted in that tradition, in the smallest, minutest way, and I mean that with absolute yaqeen, because this is a huge tradition.
That's right.
But it is one of those traditions that if you were to swim in it, you could spend the rest of your life and you will not find a shore.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading about Hakim Sayyid Barakat Ahmad Barakati, who was a student of Allama Abdul Haq Khairabadi. And he mentions that...
that's the son of Faẓl-i-Haq.
Yeah, that's right. The son of Allama Faẓl-i-Haq.
Probably Khatim al-Muhaqqiqeen as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And, this student is studying in his madrasa, and he missed a few lessons. He'd finished the syllabus. So the syllabus, when you finish the syllabus, the way of saying that you finish the syllabus is that you complete al-ʻa'mmah. So now what he was doing
al-ʻa'mmah, by the way, for someone listening, this is after the Sharh al-Aqā'id. This is
after
reading the after Khayali. This is after Jalali, Sharh al-Jalaliyyah. This is reading the ontology. This is reading the al-ʻa'mmah section from Sharh al-Mawaqif of Jurjani on the Mawaqif of Ījī. So you've got Ījī writing, then As-Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani writing, and then you got Mir Zaid al-Hirawi writing. He's talking about after he's read all of that.
All of that. Yes. And what they used to do then was, now they would begin to read the books of the Mutaqaddimin Hukama. So he's now finished the syllabus, reading the books of the Mutaqaddimin Hukama. He's missed a few lessons. And so he decided that, look, I think I'm going to take leave. I finished the syllabus. My father's calling me back as well. And so I'm going to take leave because what I've missed is too much to make up for. So he says, look, he thought to himself that Ustad Sahib's not going to give me permission to leave. So I'm going to go to my Sahiba. I'm going to go to his wife. And I'm going to take permission from her to leave. So he goes to the women's quarters and he calls for Allama Abdul Haq Khairabadis, the daughter-in-law of Allama Faẓl-i Khairabadi. And he says, look, Sayyid is at the door and he's requesting permission to leave and he's asking for dua. So she said, that's interesting because your teacher, my husband's not told me that you finished your studies. And he's like, he responds very humbly. He says, look, I have finished the books from the syllabus. I finished al-ʻa'mmah and now it's time to go. And she laughed. So she actually laughed when he said that, and she said, She said,
The household.
You've finished the books of the syllabus. So meaning you've finished al-Aḍmah and you think you're done. She said the women folk of this household complete al-Aḍmah. And your job is to go out and represent this tradition. So it's an incredible tradition. But one of the things I want to mention about Allāmah Faẓl-i Khairabadi before we close up on this section is that he does write Tahqiq al-Fatwa fi ibtal al-Daghwa as a book in Kalām. He writes Imtina' al-Nazir as a book in Kalām. And in the dhiman of that, I would also say that he also writes Hashiyah Qādi Mubarak. Now, even though the Qādi Mubarak is a work on the Sunnah, which is mantiq.
No, but they speak on ontology.
That's right. So many.
All of the commentaries on the Sunnah.
They take a student into the world of Kalām.
Yes.
And the thing is that there's so many commentaries you find of the Sunnah in this period that any new author that was to write his own commentary would have to bring something new to the table. And Allāmah Faẓl-i Khairabadi, what he brings to the table with his commentary on the Sunnah is such that he actually considered that a work as something that he would leave behind for the world. He was so proud of it that he said, I leave behind two things. One is my commentary on the Qādi Mubarak, and the other one is my son Abdul Haq, rahimahullah ta'ala. So this is incredible.
And by the way, we're gonna stop. I know you're gonna stop there now, but just to put out, even that whole discussion on the commentaries, like Alhamdulillah, like Qazi, like Mullah Hassan, and what Lakhnawi says about them, that the students used to debate with each other about my teacher's commentary, and to the point that became so mutadawil that they began to do a sort of talaqi and takrar of the Masā'il between that's why they all got included into the hawashi. So now when you're looking at the book, why do you have different hawashi around it? It's because they used to go and debate with each other. That's a period, let me say this, that is a period where you have tullabul ilm that are sat debating the tafarrudat of their teacher in the Masā'il of mantiq and umur amma, and this is happening in the 13th century.
Exactly. Like literally we could touch it.
Yeah. And that's what's so amazing. That's why we say that the tradition is not munqati'. It's colonization in India did not help, but inshallah the tradition is there, and we pray that the faiz is baqi.
So we can finish with this inshallah. Like as a last question is, where is Maturidism today?
I think there's a lot of mashallah interest, and people are growing in it and people are learning. And I think that if we can do this right and Allah Ta'ala puts barakah in it, then we can reintroduce a lot of this type of Maturidism, meaning the Farangi Mahal tradition with all of its flares and all of its tasawwuf and all of its beauty and barakah. We can inject that, very kindly back into the lives of Muslims. But there is a rise, and lots of people are interested in Maturidism. There was a little period where you had some pseudo-Maturidism, but that's irrelevant, where some people were trying to sort of hijack the tradition,
superimpose certain conclusions,
certain positions, and trying to turn them. But there's a lot of young talaba now, mashallah, that are very interested, and we hope and pray that Allah Ta'ala puts barakah in it.
Inshallah. And just to finish off, we did mention in the midst of this podcast that inshallah there will be a reading of some of the sections of the Musāyarah, inshallah. With Khairabadi Institute in the future.
Inshallah.
Just as a question, by studying this book, how will it situate a student within the grand scheme of the Maturidi tradition? Meaning, what do you think this book, and in the dhiman of that, why do you think this book was preferred by many late Maturidi scholars, especially in the Farangi Mahal and the
but even of the, like for me, like Hazrat Zalumut rahmatullah alayh used to off quote Ibn Humām, but it's that period, isn't it, where it's like an apex of the tradition, because there's a synthesis taking place. There's a lot of ta'wilat that I've done to make the school together, and it's a great work in Kalām. And if you read it, and particularly if you read it with the Hashiyah and the Sharh, al-Musāyarah and the Hashiyah, it's one of the great books of Kalām. So I think a student will get to taste Ash'arīism, Maturidism in that period, and Ibn Humām is a great writer. They'll get to experience all of that. So they can get a great tasawwur of the entire tradition as a whole.
By Muhakkik Shaykh. Barakallah. Jazakallah khairan for joining us today, and we hope you've, I hope this has been a good introduction to the Maturidis and the Maturidi tradition, and the prominent thinkers of this tradition and the prominent works within this tradition. Inshallah, I hope that from this we can this leads to some other important discussions that we will have inshallah in the future. Jazakumullahu khairan for watching, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
الحمد للمتوحد بجلاله